Hello, this is Silas here. I'm back with my friend Steven. You can say what's up.
Hello, everybody.
We're here to finish off the last part of our discussion, ongoing discussion, multi-part discussion. That's been very excellent. Good, stuff. Double plus good, in the actual good sense of it, of on critical theory by going through the book Cynical Theories, which was written by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose. I was going to mix those two together. So give us some just a little overview of the things that we've talked about and what we're getting into in this talk.
All right, so for our last several discussions, you may have watched some of the videos already. We basically gave an introduction to what postmodernism is, some of the postmodern themes, and then the various schools of thought. I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically intersectionality and critical race theory, post-colonial studies, feminism, etc. We made separate videos on each one. I recommend watching each one of those if you'd like further discussion. For the last video here, I just wanted to sort of talk about some alternatives to some of these ideologies and basically just where do we go from here. I'm going to borrow a little bit from what the author said, but also some of my own commentary plus Silas's, and I'm also going to point out some places where I disagree with the authors.
All right. So as he said, there's different parts out. This one, I've been uploading them in the order that we've actually had the conversations at the point of me actually having this conversation now. I've posted at least 5 parts, and then I'll be posting snippets and little clips from different parts of the different back and forth, little clips of interesting things in it. And we already have set up the next conversation that we're going to get into, and that's going to be about what?
So the book is called Cracks in the Ivory Tower, The Moral Mess of Higher Education. It's written by Phil Magnus and Jason Brennan. It basically is going to get into issues in higher education, but focus from the standpoint of the ethics, not so much the ideology that's taught, although we'll probably talk about that as well, but more the incentive structures as far as the way things are financed, where the money goes, the quality of education, how much or how little, I should say, students learn, what the job prospects are relative to what's promised, et cetera, et cetera. So that'll be a fun discussion, I think. I think it's a very important topic, especially with the student loan debt crisis being what it is.
Yeah. And with us, I've known Steven for quite some time, and we've learned different things from each other, and met each other through a separate meetup group about a philosophical thing. It was like Stefan Molyneux's thing, and of Free Domain Radio, and we met through that, and just through the conversations that we've had, I think we've enriched each other's lives. I think I can say that safely without saying, oh, I'm speaking for Steven. Yeah, I think he'd agree with that, right?
I do.
And the first series that we had in this actual one was you are what you consume, what you take in with things. And then now this is a specific thing. This is a critical theory. We're talking about, okay, these are the things that we've been consuming when you're talking about this practically food and just information and things like that that build up who the human being is. And with this series, I think we've been looking like, okay, this critical theory, these are some people who are talking about certain things that we're like, what is going on with this thing? What is going on with these people? Where are you coming from? So I think with this analysis, we've been trying to see, okay, what have they been consuming that makes them think this is a dish worth serving? When they talk about dinner and we sit down and have that meal, I'm like, this isn't dinner. This isn't edible. Like, why are you putting this on the table? So we're trying to understand what are they talking about. And I think this next one is going to go more to like the teaching and the education and the schooling system. I think that's going to be more specific. Why are these ideas being taught and put out into society in a certain way? And I think in that series, it's a little way I think I'm going to approach it is I've had several ideas and have traveled around the world and been in different schooling systems. And then I've been part of teaching kids in a schooling system in a different place here in Kenya. And I've thought of different ways of how teaching and okay, specifically, I think there was the information age where we're getting different information, and I think now we're going to the age of understanding. And with the current pandemic came in, and it has shut down a lot of educational systems all over the world as people were trying to adopt new ones or change new ones, or some were going on so much momentum that I think that's going to be one of the biggest things coming out of post-pandemic world is going to be the new ways of learning because people want information.
Mm-hmm.
I think that people, as you've seen in this series and as we'll continue in this discussion, and is part of the reason Stephen and I are having these conversations, is people want information. People in general like being right. They want to be right. They want to do what's right. People want to be rational, but then when you actually input information, data that's not right. Like if I just follow a recipe to bake a cake, but then I put in baking soda that's flat, that's gone out, the cake's not going to come out in the right way. Or if
Mm.
I just put in an ingredient, it's like, oh, you can put in cocoa, but I put in soil. It's not going to taste good. It's not because I was intending to not make a chocolate cake. It's because for some reason I mistook the cocoa, the soil, the dirt, the earth to be cocoa, and I put that in. So these are the things that
You
I
used
think is what.
cocoa mulch instead of baking cocoa.
Yeah, so stuff like that, and
Uh,
I think there are differences. Or I'm going to put milk chocolate instead of this like 80% dark chocolate. Depending on the recipe of the meal that you're making, the milk chocolate is just going to melt a lot faster
mhm.
than the dark chocolate, or it's going to have extra sugar. So if you're using milk chocolate and you substitute that, depending on the actual recipe, you can say, okay, I'm going to reduce the sugar because that sugarness is going to come from there. And when you have the milk chocolate or the dark chocolate, it's bitter and has. So there's other things,
Yeah.
but what you need to do is understand. Get away from the age of information where we have a deluge of information. It can get discombobulating. It's happened to me too, where I'm
Mm.
saying there's too much stuff to take in. I don't know what to do, and I'm frozen. But now you have the age of understanding where if you understand the purpose of a certain thing, if you understand the contents that are in that recipe, what this dark chocolate is supposed to do in this recipe, that's why I can't just use milk chocolate. If you understand that well enough, you'll be able to know, like, okay, banana bread, bananas do this. So if I switch out the bananas for mangoes or avocados or papayas, that switch will still do the same thing without me having to alter anything else because that's just the flavor and that's just some moisture and I just have to get the right thing. So anyway, so that's just a long ramble about why we're doing this because I think it's about age of understanding. It's about getting the right kind of information, understanding what what things are, and then the problems that many of us have in the world from just not because of what the actual thing is, but because of how we define what that thing is.
Mhm.
We're talking about we want a better world. We want human flourishing to increase, but what we define as the reasons humans have been flourishing is going to change what we decide to actually encourage and try to promote in the rest of the world. So I think I want us to be on a similar page. And I think I can say that we all agree in general. I think if you listen to this, chances are you're not one of those few people in the world who are trying to destroy the world and see everything burn. I
Yeah.
think part of you coming to click on this has already shown that you are somebody who actually wants to do something better. And not even just part of you clicking this, just the fact that you're human and I think 95% of the population in general, that's kind of what they're about. So that's my little spiel.
Sure, sure.
Okay, so getting into it now. Take us into it.
Sure. So I wanted to sort of start off by contrasting what social justice scholarship, whatever we want to call it, all these various schools of thought with classical liberalism. I'd say that they're at odds and in many cases opposites on pretty much every issue. Below, I'm going to rehash the postmodern themes and explain where, why, and how specifically. If you notice something too with me, this is something I harp a lot about. Notice I don't use the term liberal in discussion. I say leftist because the thing is, liberal and leftist, those terms in the modern vernacular are at odds with each other. Liberal, classical liberal means more enlightenment ideal. This current iteration today is in complete odds with it. One of the things I wanted to talk about is one of the reasons I think there's sort of this mix up is that modern day leftists see themselves as they see themselves as the heirs to the Enlightenment, sort of fighting against the old religion, and the people who do bring up the founding fathers, although of course that's less popular now, but the people who say, "Well, I believe in all men are created equal, but I want to take it to its logical conclusion. I believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but for everybody." They see themselves as sort of taking those ideas to their logical conclusions. Now, I think where this gets confused is what became these people was born out of a reaction against the Enlightenment. And one starting point for that could be Rousseau. Kant is sort of debatable. I know objectivists are very critical of him. I'm not as well versed on Kant, so I don't really feel positioned to make a claim on that. Of course, obviously, Hegel could be seen of the right, but depends, and then Marx, obviously, and everyone else. So in reality, what became all these different factions was born out of a reaction against the Enlightenment, out of a reaction against science, against liberalism, against reason. So that's why there's sort of that conflict. And one of the things too I also sort of wanted to touch on was there's sort of two competing views of the Enlightenment, which I think are sort of interesting. One view is something like the Enlightenment. This view gets echoed a lot by people like Ben Shapiro, who basically argued that the Enlightenment failed because reason became dominant and faith collapsed essentially. And their argument is that we can reason. Yeah, I don't subscribe to this, but let me just explain that essentially we lost because faith declined. That paved the way for us to reason our ways into some awful things. And of course, they've tried to say that was the basis for communism and National Socialism or Nazism. Now, on the surface, there are some claims that sort of support that. Obviously, communism is an atheistic philosophy. And then in the case of National Socialism, it has a lot of Darwinist themes. And I think it was Rudolf Hess who even said National Socialism is nothing more than applied biology. So they saw themselves as this is just survival of the fittest, but played out among human beings. Now, of course, where I more subscribe to sort of more the objectivist view, which says no, reason was undercut and assaulted. And if you think about it, as I touched on last time, I think Hegel believed contradictions were built into reality. He believed that reason itself wasn't the means for knowing knowledge, but that it was more just sort of something that happens among the historical dialectic. Of course, Marx saw reason as being sort of the function between classes. As far as I touched on, I think polylogism, the idea that classes just see things through the lens of identity. So the objectivist view, which I'm more in line with, is that no, it's not that reason took hold and faith seceded. It was more that reason was undercut and corrupted, and then that paved the way for some awful things. What are your thoughts on all of that?
To go back to the first thing you'd mentioned with the social justice versus liberalism, with that one, the definitions, I think it's a very key to establish why or what somebody means by what they're saying. Yeah. And the conversation we had before this was specifically on social justice, and we discussed that in there, where there might be different things that people mean when they say these terms, yet when they were actually coined, they meant a certain thing. And from what I've seen with a lot of this conversation or this series, is what we see being done in practice is quite different from what the original people actually coined in general, most of the things. And you get that with a lot of the people who are actually doing it, who will point out to some parts and like, oh, you're saying these people who are doing this, that's not about that. Look what they said at the start. That's what we're really about. And like, okay, that's what you might be about. But that person out there, that's not what they're about. They're reading a different part. Or you look at the actual original text, and you suggested that I read that article by Phil Magnus about does classical liberalism need intersectionality? And I just did that. I did the recording for that. That would be posted before this. I have a community strike on my channel now, so I don't know. It might be posted in 7 days after having this video, but I think I'll post it up on BitStreet before that. But I read that, and he made the case where it's like, okay, you can say that in general, but you look at the actual original people, and she actually does support the active. I think he talked about. I think it was like individual intersectionality or something.
He called it elementary intersectionality elementary versus compounded. Yeah.
Yes. So with the compound one, she is not listed. Most of her actual writings were about elementary intersectionality, but she has a few things in there that advocate for, allow for the actual compound ones, the compound applications. And that is something more active. So that's going to attract people. The people who are more gung-ho about it, the more active people, the more activist people will get onto that and pull that out. And you see a similar thing with the religions. And that's transitioning into what you were talking about with Ben Shapiro saying faith declined. Now, Ben Shapiro himself is a practicing Jew in the religious sense of it. He's very strong into that. You'll see someone like PragerU. That's another place where Prager is a strong Christian. And I see some people who are on my side, quote unquote, on certain political things. When you talk about politics, like left-right kind of thing. Oh, what to describe it? Dichotomy, left-right. I don't know. Whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
I agree with them on certain things, but they have that soft spot where they try to sneak in God in there, and I'm like, no. You can be atheist, but doesn't mean you're a-religious. Communism is very religious. Fascism is very religious. It just puts it in humans. Even if you look at something with that one Austrian guy with a mustache that was a failed artist, what was one of the key parts of it? First of all, First of all, the Catholic Church, was the Catholic Church really against these groups? Not so much. That was the major political force, major religious political force at that time. And they found ways to still deal with these people. So to say it was anti-religion, not so much. Or it might have been, to even say they were anti-theist, I'm not quite sure. Maybe when you talk about the communist regime, but talking about the Ubermensch, when you're talking about that Aryan myth of that blonde, blue-eyed type of person, when you talk about those things of this mythical nation and peoples that keep going on, we're higher above these other people. These are all articles of faith. These are all religious things. These are not based on actual, it's not based on scientific rote. I don't want to say scientific. Scientific is not the right term here. I'm trying to think.
Scientific, well, I was going to say scientific analysis and methodology. Like, it's not like they're going out actively testing and proving these things. It's more the
Yeah,
will to power stuff. It's more, in the case of the Marxists, it's more the material dialectic view of history, which some people could say they bastardize, but it's not. That was sort of the contention too. And like I say, that's where the liberalism thing gets mixed up, because remember, Marx said he was doing scientific socialism. He said
yeah,
my forebears were utopian, but this socialism is scientific. This is going to pan out by the laws of history. Of course, he ended up being wrong, but that he was trying to approach it from that angle.
yeah. And I've actually had a conversation with a
Yeah.
scientific socialist, a two-part conversation on these two separate videos that I had about reading different things about actual old Marxists and Leninists and
Yeah.
communist actual dogma. And when you look at the academic level, there is some sort of scientific part of it. I'm currently listening to Human Action, so I'm in agreement with what Mises says in it, where he talks about how all humans are rational. It just depends on what they're basing it on. If you truly believe there is some sort of ideal Aryan man, then some of the things Hitler was saying were rational. They're not right, they're not correct, but rationality has nothing to do with what's being right and correct. If I think it's raining outside, it's rational for me to grab an umbrella before I go outside if I don't want to be rained on, but doesn't make me 100% right that it is raining outside. So that's what I'm trying to say. Like, some things can be rational, even if they're wrong. So last thing to come to, I think it's rational that you find someone like Ben Shapiro trying to make this difference, because for him, he finds his faith has been a central part of who he is as a good person. And in
Mm.
general, he seems like a good person. Now he looks at the other people behaving in
Yeah.
certain ways, and just the same way that he believes his faith is the one true faith, he looks at Hinduism and says these people have something wrong that's going on. He looks at Zoroastrians and says they have something wrong. If there's some pagans out there worshiping Odin, like, that's not quite right. So when he sees, I think when he sees these people out there being religious in their way, in their progressivist way, in this activist way, I don't think he identifies that as religious. When he looks at communism and he sees the way they worship the leaders, they worship this higher class of people that know better than anybody else and can make decisions for entire cultures, entire societies, that central
Right.
planning type of things. He doesn't see that as religious, because I think if he admits it to be a religious type of thing, won't he have to admit that he believes in a possible being that can control the entire universe, that knows what we are all able to do, that plans everything? So that whole idea of central planning itself, in and of itself, is some sort of religious thing. You have to believe in some supernatural type of thing, because nothing that we have seen so far in nature is able to calculate and make decisions like that. Yet Ben Shapiro has admitted that he believes there is a possibility of something that can exist that can make those calculations. So when it comes to communists, socialists, and Ben Shapiro, it's not the concept that they disagree on. It's the being capable of actually doing that concept. And I disagree with the concept in and of itself. It's like, you can't do that right now. So yeah, that's just some of my thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to make a few comments on some of the things you said. Again, the definitions really matter, because, like, I always make the point to people, think about what social justice means. What is the idea of justice? Justice originally meant, I think I said this in a previous video, but it was an individual thing. If somebody wrongs you, a legal authority enacts restitution for you and revenge on them. But this is saying, no, certain groups have been wrong. Certain groups owe this, paid for by other groups. And then that gets into a question of who's where in the group. Are these groups even absolute? all these other issues that we've been talking about. And that's where I found, and I hope some of you listening maybe have concluded too, that a lot of these things fall apart because different people are in different areas, different walks of life, different income. It's very hard to put all these people into one group, whichever category you're talking about. And it's the same thing too with like how to be an anti-racist. Like, yeah, in principle, most people hear that sounds good, but then you have to look at what he actually entails and what he's criticizing. I think if you understand that, you understand why we're criticizing it. I love that Phil Magnus article. I highly recommend everyone read it. I think you'll probably put a link to it. I like what he said about how we sort of know this already, but the way he explained it about how you can't really do a regression analysis with this school of thought, because if you think about it, like typically you have a chart and it's who shows up where on the chart, and then you isolate the variables between them. But how do you do it? Because again, on this chart, if there's all these people with all these various identities, who's where on the chart? Like, is a black man here, a black man with disabilities here, a black woman? Like, it's so hard to do. And then when you challenge it, you seem to either get, this is so true, why are you questioning it? You know, don't ask for evidence, or they cite something written by the same people. So again, it becomes this self-referential religious idea, as we've been talking about. And he explains it very well. And like with him, I agree with the assessment that I think the approach at an elementary level, as Crenshaw was initially doing, I do think there's merit to that. I do think a black man is going to have problems that I don't. I think a white woman will have problems that I don't. I think a black woman will have other problems too. Where I'm critical, and I think you are too, Silas, is where it becomes this be all end all explanation for how the entire world operates, which isn't really true.
Because there's going to be different environments. Like, for example, would that black woman have, all of a sudden that black woman, if they were in Kenya, would they have the same, who would be more challenged in that environment? Now, what's the difference between a black woman who's born and raised in Kenya versus a black woman that was adopted by somebody else and moved somewhere else? And then let's say you were born and raised in Kenya. Would you have more benefits in Kenya than I would, even though I was born in France and I moved around? So there's these things where
there's so
they're
many
not
things.
the end all be alls, exactly. Yeah. It's not the main reason. When it comes down to it, the individual is going to have, every individual is going to have different challenges versus yours.
I wanted to touch a bit. There was a book, I think the author's name is Richard Weikert. He wrote a book about Hitler's religious views. It's actually a very good book because what he does is he addresses all the common claims, like, was Hitler an atheist? Was Hitler a Christian? Was Hitler a pagan cultist? All that. And he sort of addresses each claim and sort of holds up evidence that support or disproves each one. And he ultimately concluded that Hitler was a pantheist. For those who don't know, it's basically that the universe and God are one, and that the universe is a manifestation of God's will. Now, it's sort of tough to get to this because the thing is, he was influenced a lot by Hegel. Hegel was a Lutheran, but Hegel had sort of a pantheistic view, the whole historical dialectic thing. And it was tough with Hitler because Hitler read a ton of stuff. I mean, he read Kant, he read Hegel, he read Marx when he was younger, he read Nietzsche a lot, all these different people. And like any politician, he said different things to different audiences depending on who he was talking to. But for example, they said he only went into churches for weddings and funerals. He basically never set foot in them as an adult aside from those special occasions. I don't think there's any recording of him praying, but then he does say things about divine providence and all that. And then he does give speeches saying, as a Christian, I think this. But then again, it's what did he actually believe versus how is he presenting himself? But he had to sort of appeal to all these different groups to gain their support. And the book explains very well that one sort of like this proto-Nazi movement, it was called the Los von Rome, which means away from Rome movement. One of the mistakes they made was they alienated the Catholics, and some of Hitler's early supporters said, no, don't do this. This is going to be a big mistake. So they think he was sort of placating all these different groups, and then once he had enough power, he might have wiped them out, but he had to use them in the meantime to get to that point. So I highly recommend that book. I think it was very well done. The other two things I was going to sorry?
So in current speak, he might consider himself spiritual, because that's one thing when I meet someone like, I'm spiritual, I'm like, that's something we need to unpack, because I think that's where I've seen some of the most mixed up this bag of things. And they throw this in, oh, this doesn't go out, this, because it's dicey.
So I wanted to touch sort of on the Misesian view of rationality, how I think this often gets misunderstood. And I think I said this in a previous discussion, but like how when Mises says acting rationally, he doesn't mean objectively doing the best possible thing. Like a person if a person's diet was rational, they would only eat like raw vegetables and like no alcohol, nothing
Yeah.
fatty, nothing. But then you have to think about it. No, they're making a decision that they think will make them better off. They may want to eat something healthy in the moment. They may want to just something that tastes good. They may want something in between.
Wait, no, if a person's diet was rational in that sense, that rational is defined as the only objective positive, the most sorry, the most objectively positive thing to do at the time
Yeah.
to maintain health, then it would be only raw vegetables. That's what you mean. But
Yeah.
okay, so
So it's that whole thing about if a person picks up alcohol, if they're just having like a drink or two, you could say, okay, that's not the best thing for their health, but are they acting irrationally if they have like one drink? Now, if they binge, okay, that we can have a conversation about that, but it's more of a question of value judgment and what do they think benefits them in here and now. If you come out of like you're playing basketball or something, you're sweating, you're going to grab water, but in that place and time, water is a valuable thing to you. But then
yeah.
if you're just sitting in a cold room quietly, water may not be valuable to you, so you may not drink it. But again, neither person's acting irrationally. It's just a question of value judgment, place and time, and all of that.
Yeah, and we touched on this study thing and why it's very tough because there was a time when it was rational for me at that time to be taking in the amount of calories and not working, not spending, not burning the right amount of calories to be just extremely obese. And what would have to happen for somebody's life for them to consider that rational? And I think he also says in Human Action, like there's a difference between understanding something and condoning it. Like I've read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I understand why Hitler did what he did from the information that I've had from that and many other documentaries and reading a lot, because that sort of evil was something I was like, I really wish we can avoid this happening again. It was cataloged, the images that you've seen. It's something that has stuck to me where I was like, I want to see how human beings are able to do this, why this is able to happen, to try to find ways to avoid it. And to do that, you kind of have to understand part of that. And I've said this in several times, like the best people who are capable of torturing you understand you. Like you'd have to understand, the more you understand someone, the more you'll know what can truly bring them pain. The more you understand the physical body, the more you know which nerves to push and how to torture in these kind of ways. So understanding in and of itself, these things, understanding, rationality, economics, these things they're just terms. They're just descriptions of certain things. Now, when it comes to the value system, if something is good or bad, I can say I understand Hitler, and understanding why he did what he did actually made me think of how much worse that situation is, because I'm thinking about all the different ways it could have actually been stopped. How if someone just said this, if someone just did that, if he just saw this, or if somebody pushed back here, and it's like, wow, none of those things happened, and then it ended up this way. But in the inverse, it also makes me understand that it could have still been a lot worse in the same way, because if this person lost here, if this person died there, if this person hadn't done this, then he could have won. Like it's this kind of thing where but everything Hitler did was rational to what the things that Hitler had to the things that I know, and there's still many other things that happened to him that I don't even know about. So when I was obese, when I was depressed, that was rational. When I had a mental crisis, that was rational at that time. When I'm having this conversation with Stephen, it's the rational thing to do according to the things that I've experienced to be here. When you're listening, it's the rational thing to do. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at on that.
I would also recommend the Murray Rothbard essay, Marx as a Religious Eschatologist, because I wanted to sort of tie Marx to Marx. So eschatology, for those that don't know, that's the study of the end times. And they've sort of Rothbard sort of draws the parallels between Marx and that, because if you think about it, both scenarios, both Marx and the Christian end times, okay, you have dark times, people become corrupt, or the bourgeoisie sort of crush the proletariat. There's a massive struggle, either Armageddon or the workers' uprising. There's the new heaven and the new earth, or the formation of the communist utopia, and then everyone lives in peace and happiness forever, either communist utopia or heaven. So it follows the same parallels. And he also cites things that Marx wrote when he was a younger man about end times and apocalyptic scenarios. And he was kind of wondering, like, okay, did that spill out into his philosophy later as an older man, his worldview about the world ending, these people are going to be destroyed in a fiery in the Armageddon, and then there's going to be utopia after. And I've often made that point about the Marxist-born ideologies in general. Like, you can even say it about third-wave feminism. It's these are the oppressors, these are the oppressed. The oppressors have to overthrow the oppressed. The oppressors will destroy the oppressed. Then we'll have our ideal scenario after this. The Christian end times and Marx, it all follows that similar pattern. That's a very simplistic explanation, but it all sort of runs in that same vein.
Yeah, and I'm not when I say this, I'm not talking about whether these things are right or wrong with what people are saying. That's something you could see. If you are in some kind of ideology or some kind of movement that is big on end times talk, chances are, good chance are it's religious. Good chance are it's almost a theology, if not a cult of sorts. And you see that in politics. Politics came from religion. Religion, the church and state used to be just together. It used to be synonymous. It used to be this system. And then the field of politics came from religion, I think. I don't know. Look at the history of that. But you look at people on the political right, climate change, the world is ending. This, the 10 years, it's going to be disaster. The world is ending. Oh, if Biden wins, America is going to end. It's going to be the end of times. You're going to be rioting in the streets. America is going to be over. Oh, if the immigrants come in, they're going to end the country, end the way where their life is. That whole religious thing is part of what human societies have been built on, and it continues in these kind of secular forms. I actually did a post about something with Trump, and somebody posted on and was like, some of the people actually believe he's the God Emperor and would defend him depending on no matter what he did. And I asked the person, you don't get that is a complete troll. Like, that was a meme made up from Warhammer 4400 or 4000 or something, that whole God Emperor of the world. Like, people don't actually believe it. I asked the person, how many Americans do you think literally believe he's the God Emperor? And I've seen other people, I think it was Roxay, who said, let's call him the God Emperor as much as possible because that will trigger people. And I was like, no one will actually believe that. But this individual might actually have believed that there are people out there who think of Trump as some kind of God. And there are some people say he's God sent. That is tying in religion. Trump has been sent by God to save the United States of America, which is the country selected by God in order to save humans and take us to heaven. So if Trump is taken out, that is going to be part of the end times. So Obama is the second coming of the Antichrist. These things are tied into it. When you talk about religious things, that's in there a lot, where it's like white supremacy is going to destroy the world. We need to take them down. This is an existential crisis. Those things are still very true and very full in our world. So less people might be identifying with traditional religions, but just how Christianity, Judaism, Islam came about, people were more religious, I'd say, before that, before they adopted these religions. I don't know if they were more religious, but there was those religions going on before that, and then people switched to these ones, going, especially when they were switching to monotheisms, which was like, okay, now that's not even like, people were like, is that even God's? What are you talking about? One God? Like, that's not even faith. That's not even religion. So I think that's a similar thing going on now. Now we're switching where it's like, okay, there's no God, but there's still spirituality. There's still these supernatural forces that humans can wish and hope and push for, that could actually destroy the world by you personally not putting in your hopes and thoughts, which is just the difference of hopes and prayers. Your hashtags. It's okay. There's thoughts and prayers. Thoughts and hashtags? Is that the new one? What would be the equivalent of thoughts and prayers, you think, for the more current?
I've seen well wishes and things like that. So thoughts, well wishes.
It's like your offenses and hashtags. Now, instead of thoughts and prayers for the rest of the world, you need to be giving hashtags, your signals, your virtue signals and hashtags. Signals and hashtags out to you. Now, like, they think by virtue signaling and hashtagging, now that's going to actually change the world in the same sense where people before thought by going to the church and praying, that's going to have a similar effect. Those are, I think, similar things that have continued. Yeah.
Yeah. So moving on, I'd say I get why people sort of oppose classical liberalism, because look, people are not equal, that not everyone will become a millionaire, not everyone will have a lot of power and money. One of my favorite essays on the subject is Murray Rothbard's Egalitarianism as a Revolt Against Nature. That's very good. And he gets into just differences between people in general, and some of that's very broad. And I think since he wrote it, there were probably even more differences as far as IQ, brain science, all that. So when you understand that basic premise, you realize how egalitarianism can't work, because people are not equal. There's no way. And also, it's not only people will make different money, people have different positions of power, but it's also who benefits who. Having Einstein being able to publish his general theory of relativity, that's why we have GPS tracking, radiotherapy, and all that. We also have the nuclear bomb, unfortunately, but but in the past,
Unfortunately.
well, but the thing is, in the past, I'm sure there were people that were just as intelligent as him. But what power did they have? What potential did they have? They may have been burned as
Yeah.
witches. They may have been killed in wars. They may have just kept their mouths shut because they didn't want trouble, whatever. So ultimately, allowing these exceptional people to do these things, that's how we all progress. And I've tried to make that point about capitalism more generally. Yeah, there will be rich people, but allowing more innovation, allowing more production, that'll drive down prices, make better goods, more goods, and that benefits everyone, even the poorest off.
Yeah, okay. With the nuclear bomb thing, I was saying that people were like, "Oh, he's pro bomb." Like, no, I've seen those libertarian memes where it's like, "This is the future you want," and some guy with like a wheelbarrow with a bomb in it, and then somebody photoshopped like the nuclear sign onto the bomb.
Yeah.
It's like everyone should have bombs. Yes, the world would be. I think the world would be better if every single person had a nuke. Because one thing you can kind of think, like theoretically, I can theorize, I can make an argument for it. I think we sat down and had some time to put this together. You can argue that the nuclear bombs ended the proliferations of wars that were existing. Because think about it, it was World War One that ended. A lot of people died.
Yeah.
And then what happened after that? Then they're just like 15 years later, a lot more people died. Yeah. Without those nukes, chances are there would have been another one. Like during the Cold War, there would have been another one. The Cold War was actually due to the nuclear bombs. People were like, if we actually start that, the whole nuclear deterrent of having the bombs. And then when you look at history, this again is in Human Action, which again, I suggest everybody pick up Human Action, listen to it. Man, Economy, and State is, if I had to suggest one book for someone to read, it would be that. I think Human Action, I'm still working my way through it, might be the second book now. But he's talking about how history is just history. You can't disagree with actual figures in history. Now, you can go and you can say, you can put different spin on it, and it's not fake news, it's not fake history, but depending on what stand you're, what side of the thing you're on, you're gonna be like, okay, that happened. This happened. What happened happened. But then how are you going to take what happened and value what happened is going to differ depending on what side you're on.
Right.
But something that was happening during World War II, Japan was continuing to fight on because Japan had this idea where the emperor was their god made human. The emperor couldn't lose. If their god that was responsible for creating the world, creating existence, was putting their nation in the position to actually be the one that crumbled, it was so hard for many of them to actually theorize a post-reality creating being existing. Like, what do you do? So you just keep fighting because we're going to find a way. We're going to find a way. The place was being firebombed. Hundreds of thousands of people were dying a week. Different places in the country, different places were happening. They would keep fighting. They just kept going on. They weren't giving up. If this was something that was happening somewhere in the West, they may have given up before it, but they have a different mentality there. There was different people. If you could actually show, and this is something that you can actually check, you can actually go to the American military high command or whatnot. These things might have been declassified by now, and see where the bombing runs are supposed to be. You could probably see which countries or which locations, which cities were supposed to be bombed on that same day, supposed to be bombed the next week, supposed to be bombed a month away, and see the hundreds of thousands of people that would have died at that time. And if you can show this to those people and say, yes, those two bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and hundreds of thousands of people died on that. But if those bombs hadn't been dropped, your city would have been next. Your city would have been next. Your city would have been next. And you talk to all those people who are alive today because those two bombs. So that's what I'm saying. When the thing happened. The past has happened. Like Einstein did what he did. Then the people after made the bomb after that. But the bomb in and of itself, that's why I say like just having the bomb because of what Einstein did, in and of itself isn't unfortunate. The things that were done with the bomb, I think now we can start talking about unfortunate or not. But the existence of things, I'm getting very semantic, maybe pedantic with this, but I'm trying to be very specific with the language and the way I go forward in talking about certain things. When I'm talking about something coming into existence, I can, when it's just something like that, something like a bomb, because why are we focusing on the bomb instead of the nuclear? The entire process behind the bomb is also the entire process behind nuclear fission that provides all this energy that I think will be part of why humans are able to go to other planets and things like that. And when you start getting in the entire notion of he did this and that technology led to all these things, I think all in all, the positives that you can direct primarily to the bomb or to whatever the invention of the bomb was will outweigh the negatives. And me saying that now, I understand if you hear me say that and you're like, Silas, you're a shit person because that's hundreds of thousands of people dead. Have at it. If I can communicate that in a better way, maybe I'll be able to develop in a different way. But that's kind of why I was like, I don't know.
Well, if I remember too, I think memoirs came out from the emperor in the 80s or so where he said, if we had been invaded, I would have ordered everyone to fight to the death. So and
Yeah.
again, how many lives would that have cost? Because you think of the samurai with their seppuku, they lose a battle, they fall on their sword. They're not going to just say, oh yes, we surrender, we give up. But it got to a point where, okay, you see these cities destroyed in nuclear blasts. And Truman says we're going to continue to drop these till Japan stops fighting. And it's okay. We're up against a wall at this point. We have to.
And it's tough. Like these are things that I used to be just one of those people who was like, America is one of the worst countries in the world because of those bombs. I just didn't know information about it. I didn't know the context of it. The action itself of 100,000 people blinking out of existence like that is horrific.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that isn't horrific, but when you look at economics, what is the alternative of not dropping those bombs at that time? So that's the thing. Like some of these politicians, we're not looking about things the same way. They have different considerations than your average human being. Your average human being wouldn't have started the war to begin with.
No.
But once you're in the war with some of them, they need an out to be like, okay, I can quit now. Like if it's just these smaller minor things, people are still going to be routing up. We can't really visualize this in this way. And this is part of the reason I think the world is a better place today, is we have the ability to see. I think the amount of suffering that we'd see from those firebombs, to me, one of the most moving pieces of cinema I've ever watched was Grave of the Fireflies. And it's an animation, it's an anime about some kids living after the wars. And it still makes me emotional. So it's a great show. And that kind of horror, knowing that kind of information, like I talked about, understanding things to me makes the world a better place. Understanding what Hitler did made it worse. Understanding what happened for those bombs to be dropped is part of why I'm making a video like this. Is part of why I'm trying to have these conversations so we can we need to get more understanding and not be so against each other and talk about the world is ending, these people are evil, these people need to die. And we need to get to a point where we're having conversations instead of getting to those points where we're sitting there, it's like, if we don't drop these bombs, we're going to have to do worse things. Yeah. That is a horrific place to be. Let's not get back to that.
Sure. All right. So the 2 points of disagreement I actually have with the authors are on capitalism and democracy. One of the authors says something like Marx was acting against unrestricted capitalism. I think their view of capitalism is pretty flawed. I think that I don't blame them. I mean, of course, these are two people of the left, given all the stuff that's taught in academia. Yeah. I know that Lindsay knows who Rothbard is because he's mentioned him in conversation, but I'm pretty sure they haven't sat down, read Man, Economy, and State and other books based on some of the arguments they're making. Because he said in other conversations things like, oh, when the libertarians get nuts with their ideas, or oh, my conservative friends want a flat tax that makes no sense. I want progressive tax. And again, I have tremendous respect for Lindsay, obviously, but I think that he hasn't really engaged a lot of those other arguments to sort of hear where people are coming from. There's still a bit of that. Oh, clearly smart people are supposed to support these ideas. That's one of the that's one of the issues. I mean, again, tremendous respect for James Lindsay, been a big influence, but that's an area I think he's a bit off base.
With that one, you watched that video where I went to the history of capitalism, the word capitalism, how it came to be, and as you said, you stopped using liberalism or left liberalism. That's one word that I stopped.
I say leftist.
Yeah, I will say free market capitalism if I need to use the word capitalism. We just talk about market economies, more freedom in the market. Free market to me is more accurate because according to the history of the term, I think what Lindsay and them might have been thinking about, like I said, problems occur not because of what X is, because of how we define X. What they use capitalism as a word for might be wrong. Again, I haven't read what he said. I haven't heard the further. It could just be easily. It's as likely as not that he's just been indoctrinated into
Yeah.
the bastardized form of that term.
Yeah.
But that bastardized form of the term might actually be closer to what the original term was created as. And then it was Rothbard actually that changed that word and refurbished it into, I think, what we're talking about with the free market. So in that situation, and economics is one of the youngest fields of science, and it could also be a thing where that it hasn't really solidified yet what that term means, but yet free market itself is very clear, and there's never been a state in the past where there was unrestricted free markets. So with that aspect, yes. But then depending on how you define capitalism, he might have been somewhat on point.
Well, because
Yeah.
Peter Boghossian has said similar things. Like he talked about the crisis in 2008 and he said, oh, this is getting me to rethink capitalism. But then I hear that and I'm like, well, wait a minute. Do you know about the subprime lending? Do you know about the Federal Reserve? Do you know, like, and again, I don't, obviously brilliant man. Like, I don't think it's that he doesn't get it. I think he hasn't had all those arguments explained to him. Like he hasn't listened to Tom Woods or Peter Schiff or someone even, not even read Rothbard, but like listen to some of those more popular libertarian thinkers with their shows. Like he hasn't listened to those explanations. I think if he did, he'd be like, okay, maybe that makes sense.
Yeah, he just
Yeah.
clearly those words can't
Yeah.
be meaning the same thing we think
No.
those words mean.
No.
That's just, I think it's clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Okay,
the
so you
other
said
is
the other thing was
democracy.
which
Well,
could be the same thing. It could be the same thing with this is a challenge to our democracy. What does he define democracy as? So yeah, go ahead.
well, I was going to recommend the Hans Hermann Hoppe book, Democracy, the God That Failed. Really good book. Basically, he gets into how a lot of democracies devolve into tyrannies. He gets into some interesting things about how, as voting rights expand, governments expand too. How, as women get the right to vote, governments expand as well. And obviously we can get into the merits of all those claims, but at the same time, there is something to that about certain people do want larger government. It goes to sort of the idea, which we'll talk about in the next section, about with colleges, the cost being spread out about. So again, spread out amongst so many people, people think, oh, this isn't a big deal, but they don't see the cumulative effect of all these things over periods of time adding up. And that's why it leads to a lot of these problems.
Yeah, and one more thing on the free market and also in democracy. Part of why I'm for individualism and for free markets instead of socialism and this democracy where we're all tied together. I don't want to be subjected. I don't want you to be subjected to the bad decisions I might make about certain political issues.
Yeah.
So if you have this situation where we're not tied in together, it's not just people focus on, oh, these people have all these good things that we want some of those. Give me some of them Gibbs. It's like no. We talked about this before we started this conversation. Is there's also that opposite effect of if you have a system like that, you're also freed from actually being damaged by somebody making a bad decision.
Yeah.
I don't want someone at Goldman Sachs to have the ability to make a bad investment in something and then have everybody else have to pay for his problem with with money being taxed away from us.
Yeah.
I want that person to be dealing with it on his own, make his case to the people who are going to invest into him. If he loses, he's actually the one going bankrupt and things like that, not everybody else. It's not a situation where like, oh, now hundreds and thousands of people rely on his business actually existing because the government has actually created a regulatory environment where there hasn't been enough competition to make that company to be actually responsive enough to the market that they've just been invested in this one place because they're like, oh, we'll be backed up. We don't have to make sure these are actually good investments. And then it gets to the point where it's like the government's like, well, now that they employ 10,000 people, we can't let them fail because 10,000 people will be out of work. It's like, no, how did they even get to the point they were employing that many people to begin with? Because you allowed them to corner that market and not have a situation where there's maybe 100 different people employing, like 100 different people who are employing 10 people. Is it 10 or would it be 10 or 100? So I don't know what I'm saying. I'm getting my math all mixed up here. But anyway, so you have that situation. So there's one Goldman Sachs making a mistake or two other companies doing that. They're employing 200 people or so. And then the other people, the 800 other people made other decisions, invested in other things. So when that one company goes down, that in this current regulatory environment was able to employ all 10,000 people, or all, I'm getting my numbers mixed up, all 1,000 people, now you have a situation where there was different companies and it's only two companies that were doing that, and then the 800 other people were in other companies doing other things, invested in other ways. So it's a better world the more individualist we are in that kind of sense. It's something that frustrates me.
Well, I bring this point up with the race stuff too. Like people worry about, in a free society, racists will be given reign. I say, well, first off, segregation was a government policy. There were even
Yeah.
private businesses that pushed to overturn it, like the transportation industry. I think that's what Plessy versus Ferguson was about. I have to look, but it's if a business says we're not going to serve black people, they're going to get boycotted, they're going to get bad press, all
Yeah.
that. It's not like, what power does that one small business have? Whereas if the government says no, you have to separate all these people, well, you can't. You're not going to fight the government. You're going to have to really lobby for change, and it's going to be much harder and much bigger fight.
Yeah, I think Yelp just recently did that. They said they're
Yeah.
going to add something on their site, and Yelp, for those few who don't know, and most people watching probably know,
Yeah.
is an aggregator or a business review site where people come on and they say, "Oh, this." It started with food, right? It's like, "Oh, this is a good
Yeah.
restaurant. Oh, here's the menu of this place, or here's the number for
Yeah.
delivery," and then now it went into other businesses. Now it says, "Oh, if this business has done something racist." Now again, this will come to an issue of how you define racism.
Yeah.
But regardless, if I actually know that X business has done something I actually define as racist, I'm not going to go to that business. I'm not going to go to that business because the government tells me I can't. I'm not going to go because I don't want to go. So you don't need the state to come and tell you. I don't need the state to tell me that I should allow everyone into my store. I shouldn't be telling people they can't come and watch my channel because they have X kind of race. And even if I wanted to, I should. It's just like sort of say, like there's people who are going to make the decision. This is what I'm talking about, the religious aspect of it. Because people say, without God making these rules, you're just going to be a horrible person. Without the state telling racists they shouldn't do this, people are just going to give power to racists. So like, what do you think of people? Do you think I don't need God or the state to tell me that racism is bad? I just consider racism to be a bad thing, and I think most human beings agree with me. And they don't need to be told this.
I just find the whole wokey view of human nature to be very strange. Like they don't trust average people. Like, oh, we need the government to do this because people are bad. We need the government to do this because people are bad. People are cynical. People are greedy. People are self-interested. Well, what's your solution? Oh, give these people more power. And it's like,
Yeah.
why do you think that that doesn't apply to those same people? And I can never seem to get a concise answer on that. And it's just because of the party they're affiliated with, because they tell you what you want to hear. Like, I'm not. Well, and we'll get more into this on the next video series. Like, I'm not of the belief that people are innately good or people are evil. I think most people are a mix, but people look out for themselves first and foremost, and you have to factor that into decisions. It's not like,
Yeah.
okay, it's just the system is great, it's just bad people running it, and you can find this army of altruistic angels who are just going to care for everyone else. That doesn't exist. I mean, you might get somebody like that, but then even if you do, they're not going to be there forever. Someone self-interested is going to come in, and I don't really get this view of human nature. And again, I've asked different people, but I can never get a concise answer on it.
And that's why I was saying that's where the religious part comes in. It's just a faith. It's a disconnect from your, I don't want to say logic. It's a disconnect from. It's a point where you just
It's a
can't
disconnect from reason for sure.
Yeah, there's the cognitive dissonance that comes in where you're like, okay, we can't take it that far, because if I do go that far, I'm going to have to take many steps back to kind of redo certain things.
Yeah.
Where you just like, okay, I'm going to let that. Let's just not look at that. Like, people are people. We're animals. Like, I don't think house cats are bad, but if you die in an apartment with your house cats, after a day, they'll start eating your face. Like, it doesn't mean those house cats want to eat your face, but in general, they just. They eat faces. They need to eat. They'll find ways to eat. I don't think politicians in general are hateful people, even though I think one of the main differences of the states, as I mentioned before, is it gives you the monopoly of legal violence over a given area.
Yeah.
So there are some people who are attracted to that. There are some people who are more comfortable with being around the ability of doing that. Just how there's some people who a gun can do many things. A gun can protect you. A gun can harm you. Some people are like, I'm not comfortable being around a gun at all. But some people are okay being around a gun for various reasons, because they know they have the control to use that gun when it's needed, or they want to use that gun when it's not needed. So there's different kinds of people. The people are the people, but the tool itself is the tool. The state is the state. The
You
people are the people. Yeah.
sorry. You made me think of that old Simpsons episode where Homer gets a gun and he starts using it for everything. Like he turns the TV off and so shoots out light bulbs.
It seems like that. That's a
Yeah.
good episode because it
Yeah.
seems that's how some of the people on the gun control type of side think guns are used. Or it's just like
Yeah.
everything gun. Like, oh, if I have an issue in my life, gun. It's that's not how most of the gun owners I know, most of the human beings I know wouldn't act that way
No.
around a gun, especially if they've been educated and learned and understand what that gun actually is.
Yeah.
I'm pretty much saying if you can't get a gun, if you're there in America and you're listening to this and you don't have a gun, check where you're at, get a gun, go take some lessons into it, get aware with it. It's a good tool to have in your toolbox. Yeah. Okay.
So liberalism, it's
That
a working.
might get a strike, actually. We're got a YouTube strike and just had on my mind.
Oh boy!
I don't want to put that.
You might get a one where you talked about Hitler acting rationally in the context they edit that part.
And then the nuclear bombs. This video. I need to get a separate website. I'm working on getting a separate location up for these conversations. Okay, keep going.
So liberalism, ultimately, it's a work in progress. It's like science or reason, where it's not some book of answers. It's a tool that we use to keep arriving at the right answers. Like James Lindsay said, science, ultimately, it's an accumulation of errors. I've made the example a few times, but we knew Aristotle was wrong in physics, so Isaac Newton changed that. Then Einstein figured out areas Newton went wrong. And who knows, they're talking about reconciling quantum mechanics with the general relativity. So they think that'll be the next big thing. Now, I don't know enough about this to explain it well, but from what he was saying, that's sort of the gap that they're trying to bridge. And who knows what they may find. I think it could be very exciting. And then we could get into more things about subatomic particles, maybe build a teleportation device. Yeah, who knows? But again, it's an ongoing process. It's not, here's this book of answers that we constantly look to. It's this tool that we use to try and arrive at the best answers we can.
Yeah. And that's a thing. Hard sci-fi is my favorite genre of anything to intake. And some of the parts that kind of put me off. One of the main things is when people are smoking cigarettes in the future. I'm like, people are not going to be smoking cigarettes in the future. We're already on like vape and stuff like that. It'd be very few people, I think, doing that stuff. One of the other things is nations or beliefs in gods. Like people will still be talking about, oh, we're still talking about Jesus and Christianity, and this is like hundreds of thousands of years in the future when people are traveling in almost warp speed around the universe. I'm like, I don't know. I think we'd have developed other religions between then. Or when they have the same nations and the same kind of voting systems of democracies. I think it's just hard to imagine what a possible other political system could look like, because it's not as clean a science of saying like, okay, we understand physics, which is this quick and a testing thing, and then we can get this and we can imagine what sort of spaceship we'd need, what kind of engine we'd need to push a physical thing through space to a certain location. So that's more practical. Think of the future technologies. But the future way human beings will be interacting as societies is a lot difficult, because you'll still have people talking about China or United States of America. It's a question to people out there listening. Do you think the way the world is aligned now is the way the world will be aligned for the rest of the future? Like, do you think now United States of America is forever? Do you think Japan is forever? Do you think Russia is forever? Like, as long as there's still human beings alive on Earth or aware of the Earth, there will be an area around Russia called Russia. There will be the North American continent called the United States of America. Do you think those constructs are going to exist as named for the in perpetuity of humanity? I don't think they will.
No.
I think there is going to be a post-United States of America world. And for some people, they literally think if United States of America ended, they can't imagine a world existing without United States of America, let alone a positive world. And I think it will be replaced by something better. I'm not saying it will end because it's not good. I'm saying I see the good in America actually being the foundation for something better. I don't know.
Yes, I agree. So for the next section here, I wanted to talk about freedom of speech and debate. And I think, for example, one thing that's exceptional about America is we have it enshrined as in law. I saw an interesting poll which was talking. Sorry, what was that?
I said that's something magnificent that people underestimate how ridiculously amazeballs of a convention that is. Like, it's People need to understand that. Yeah.
Well, because I saw a poll saying something like these countries have the freest speech, or this speech is more free here. But notice it's measured of degrees. It's not you can just say whatever you want, except for like defamation or slander or something. It's no, there's various degrees of it, and then that gets into discussions about hate speech laws. Well, what's considered hate speech? That goalpost keeps shifting too. So that creates a whole other list of problems.
Yeah. And we're talking about those nuclear bombs thing, and that's the thing. The information is power thing, and this is a nuclear bomb. Everybody can get online and converse with you. Right now, the different platforms, but world where we're not going to have those centralized controls. It's not going to be Facebook, YouTube, Google. We're going to have a way where people have more access to being this. I came up with the internet. I have memories of not having the internet. I have memories of AOL.
Yeah.
Those kind of websites. When websites were so hard to make, now anybody can pretty much make a website. If you can hear this, you can have your own personal website on some kind of platform that's relatively cheap and things like that. But then now you'll go further where people will be able to get information. Like right now, my videos can still get strikes because of where I'm posting them. But we'll get to the point where everybody will have relative access, as easy access as you have to YouTube, to be able to get on something where somebody has a complete choice to message to you in the way that they have. And that is such a magnificent thing where it's almost where it's like the concept of freedom of speech couldn't have even been something that was brought up because we didn't have the ability to even think of guaranteeing that or think of even saying that's something that should be guaranteed because it's amazing.
Yeah. So I wanted to the authors cite John Stuart Mill a bit here. He had some very good arguments for freedom of speech. One of the things that people forget is restricting speech. It not only impacts the person speaking, but also the listeners. People don't get to hear certain things. So in John Stuart Mill and On Liberty, he says, but the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. So basically, it's harmful, not just you restrict people speaking, but also, again, the people don't get to hear a certain opinion. And who knows, that could change a person's mind, which leads to them making a discovery, which leads to them spreading the idea to someone else who does, and on and on. More information is generally better, as we've been talking about, and you've done in your other videos too, Silas. Like, obviously, what you do with that information matters, but restricting information generally is not helpful.
And that is actually the key part of freedom of speech. When we're talking about freedom of speech, that is what it is.
Yeah.
Because I don't think anybody really cares if I say I'm going to go to an island where nobody can hear me and just say whatever I want to say to no one. No single institution in the world would really care about that.
Yeah.
I think it's about the people saying, like, when you have a community strike, it's a community guideline strike. It's you said this and we don't want all these other people to say this. Or you said this and other people heard it, and then they might do this. That is what it is. It's the whole, like, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, doesn't make a sound. If your speech is said in the woods and nobody hears it, does it make an effect? Does it have an effect? No. It's freedom of speech is all about freedom of who hears what and what's actually done in it. So yeah.
So he goes on to point out how censorship harms the opponents of the ideas being spoken in two ways. He says, if the opponent is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. And if wrong, they lose, which is what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. So what he's saying is that not if somebody says something right and they don't get to hear it, well, they miss out on learning something. But then if they're wrong, it gives them an opportunity to strengthen their beliefs and also compare and contrast and say, okay, are there areas in my beliefs that could use work or reform? That I think is very key. He talked about Isaac Newton's physics and mechanics and how they were produced in an environment that allowed freedom of speech and inquiry. He said, he basically argued, and this is writing in maybe mid to late 19th century. He says, he basically argued that because they could withstand scrutiny, it showed their strength. So he says, if even the Newtonian philosophy were not permitted to be questioned, mankind could not feel as complete assurance of its truth as they now do. The beliefs which we have most warrant for have no safeguard to rest on, but a standing invitation to the whole world to prove them unfounded. If the challenge is not accepted or is accepted and the attempt fails, we are far enough from certainty still, but we have done the best that the existing state of human reason admits of. We have neglected nothing that could give the truth a chance of reaching us. So basically he's saying that they were discovered in an environment that allowed freedom of speech and inquiry. And then by allowing them to continue to exist in that environment, somebody can come along, challenge them or criticize them. And if nobody comes up with valid arguments, well, they're the best we have. If someone does prove them wrong, then that it leads to something better. And that's ultimately kind of the plot twist, is that about half a century later, Einstein had his general theory of relativity, which, as I've said, led to GPS, radiotherapy, and other things. So it ended up proving his point right about half a century after his death, that freedom of speech allowed the existing standard to be challenged, and that ultimately led to something better. And again, as long as we continue to allow that to happen, who knows? I mean, people maybe will find Einstein was wrong about something, or Einstein was incomplete, or all that. But it's, you allow the environment for that to happen. That's the key here.
Yeah.
Any thoughts or ideas?
It's just again reiterating that, where I think we can all think of hearing something or getting some sort of information that has changed our lives for the better, that before the internet, that 40 years ago, the means that information came to you would not have existed.
Yeah.
So just from that alone, I think a lot of people see and they say, oh, there's currently an American election coming up. And people say, oh, social media has ruined the world, has made it this bad, or this is horrible, or we have these people doing these terrible, terrible things. 100 years ago, there's all these memes where it's like, oh, 100 years ago before social media, people just hanging out, and it's like somebody with a guillotine, and then people with pikes in the street. You know, it's like they didn't have social media. No, things of the past. 100 years ago, there was world wars. The world wars. I am making the case, and maybe you can explain to me how you think it would happen. How would the world wars begin right now if you had social media? If you had somebody, who was it? Wasn't Franz Ferdinand? Who was that situation that this is sparked up? The Duke of somewhere? I'm forgetting.
Duke.
Like World War II.
Well, the Austrian Archduke who was assassinated, that's Franz
Yes.
Ferdinand. Yeah, Franz Ferdinand, yeah.
Now, if you had that whole situation, but that was actually, you had as many people on average that have cameras, you had people sitting there recording it, live tweeting it, like it was shown live on Facebook, and all that information went out. And then the person who did it had all these sources. You can get his profile, you can get all these background about him, then everybody else involved with all these things. So with all that, how do you think that would have taken? Do you think that it wasn't I don't want to say misunderstanding, but do you think it would have fallen from there and blown up into what it was? I don't think it necessarily would have. When the horrors that were happening in Germany, if you just had all those people, and this kind of happened in China a bit in the start of the pandemic, they said all these phones kind of disappeared, and with the phones disappearing, they said like millions of phone accounts kind of disappeared, and I think that was more just when the economy shut down. In some countries, you have people with multiple cellular phones or things like this, and you just and they're living on a cusp. So like, oh, all of a sudden we have, and this happened in the United States of America, I think, in a different extent. Okay, cell phones in other countries, getting information in different places, are kind of the equivalent of cars. We have certain people who live lifestyles where they just have multiple cars, and then now with the pandemic, with things being shut down, not being able to travel, lots of people stopped paying the leases, returned the cars that they have, and okay, now we have a family with one car. Previously, we had 3 cars. So now if you look at those figures in the United States of America and say, oh, all of a sudden there's like 10 million cars no longer owned by people, it doesn't mean 10 million people died. It just means they downsized. No. Yeah. So I think that's the same thing with those phones. But if you had a situation like in Germany, when all of a sudden millions of Jewish phones just disappeared.
Yeah.
They were no longer tweeting. They were no longer on social media. People would have noticed. Like, I'm just saying, like, these technology and this information that we're having, they're just tools, and they're making the world better for us. So that's just some of the things that frustrate.
Because, I mean, how many of those Jewish people had relatives in it or friends in America? If they had been like, hey, my friend is no longer tweeting. Hey, my friend's, wait a minute, what's going on here? That would have raised,
There's so many things where it's just, there's a lot of things that and it's in part because of those things happen. Like I'm saying, in part because of what Hitler, in part of what Hitler was doing was part of why Einstein decided to stop doing all the other things he could have been doing and started doing what he was doing. And because some people thought that a bomb would actually be something to stop what Hitler was doing, they decided to invest whatever amount of money could support Hitler. So there's all these things. When you just look at history, history just is. Actions just are actions. When we come to what is good, what is bad, that is a subjective thing. That is something that we decide on. And there's going to be objective things. Some things end up being more for human flourishing. Some things end up being worse. Like
Yeah.
the pandemic right now, lives are dying, but there's some things that are going to do. I think there's going to be better systems set up. We're going to demand and create that they be better systems ready for the next pandemic that happens, because one will come. Like,
Yeah.
and we'll be better prepared for having gone through this, for some people, horrific situation that we're going through now. So yeah, it's just some talks.
Well, Einstein was also said to have said, if I had known the Germans wouldn't succeed, I would have had nothing to do with the bomb. I think he had some regret there. But again, like we touched on, look at all the other things that were created with nuclear energy, all of that and all that. And I'm thinking of the same thing with media and social media, especially. It's a whole negativity bias thing. Like, people will complain, oh, these people are posting all this offensive stuff and all that. But okay, how many conversations are you having with friends? How many things are you looking up? How many recipes are you getting that you like? How many funny videos are you watching? Like, how much value are you getting out of it? Would you be willing to have all that go away because some people said something offensive? And I don't think most people would.
Yeah, there's like just some friends, friend who I also met through that the free domain meetup group in the city. He met his wife. They just had kids. They had kid. I think the kid's almost born. But yeah, they met through that free domain group, and he just sent one of her notifications on the wall. It was like, oh, 4 years ago, I started with a friend request, and now we have this family. We're married. It's things
really
like that.
Cool.
There's a lot more of that than the inverse happening. And still, this is a testament to humanity that the bad things stick out that much more than the good things. When the good things are going on in our life, it's we take those for granted, we see them. But when something bad happens, we freeze, and it's like we're getting in all the information, like, oh my God, this car is coming in. And you can think that's not normal. And that's a testament to humanity, I think.
Well, I was also going to say, with the media, they talk about polarizing people. Like, if you look at the older newspapers and things back earlier in the country, they said some vicious stuff. Like, there were songs about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and things like that. Like, and the papers were explicitly partisan. Like, oh, we hate Jefferson, we like Adams, all that. It's people say like, oh, the good old days when people were friendlier. Like, no, they were just as bad. Maybe probably. Yeah.
I was just listening to somebody who was Red Pill Germany person. He was talking about how, like, oh, the good old days now, like, Germany is a banana republic because this one politician is being very corrupt, and the good old days have been fired. I was like, wait, what good old days, dude? Like, back in the 70s, it was still like East Germany and West Germany. You think politicians were less corrupt back then? Before that, Hitler? Or is it the good old days? Like, the Habsburgs? What are you talking
Bismarck,
about? The good old days. So it's. I think if you find a way to say, in this culture, we define this as good and we define this as bad, and you look at the percentage of good and bad as defined by the culture at that time, I think right now we are at one of the lows on the actual good existence of good and bad. It's just that we have far more information, access to information that we've ever had. That, let's say the average of, let's say you break things down to round numbers, hundreds of things, then the average of entire human society has been 25 out of 100 things are going to be bad. That's the average. Now, I think we're at a time where 5 out of 100 are bad. But in the past, you'd only hear about one of those things every day because you just had no access to information. Today, you hear about all 5, and not just all 5 every day, in full detail. And those 5 keep getting repeated over and over again. So every day you're hearing about the 5 that happened today, the 5 that happened yesterday, the 5 that happened last week, the 5 that happened 10 years ago. And then they even go back to the ones that happened in the past and start connecting you to the 25 that they didn't hear about before. And it seems like all those things are happening now, but they're not. And one of the key things is with the figures on the pandemic. There's been worse pandemics, but the testing has been nowhere close to what we're having now.
No.
Sometimes here, we had a kick up on the actual test. Well, they're testing more people, and they're also bringing in tests of people that were tested months ago are being actually reported now. So there's this thing of the amount of information coming in versus the actual existence of what's actually going on. But yeah.
The authors make a very good argument here too. They say, like, even if the social justice theories were 99% right and the critics like us were 99% wrong, freedom of debate would still be beneficial because it'd be a chance for us to learn something. It would also be a chance for them to strengthen their ideas. And also, I like the way they phrase this: give them rational confidence in their views. Let's put our ideas out here. Let's have the best arguments made against them. If they still hold up, those are solid views. And I think in the present discourse, that's something I keep criticizing. That I don't see that. It's just, you're supposed to take this on faith or because someone tells you to, and then you're not supposed to question it. And then ultimately that's bad for both sides, because when people like me say, okay, this is just another religion, then people like them, they don't get to actually think through all their premises and have a strong foundation. Instead, it's just what I was told to think, what I want to think, all that. And then when that gets challenged, it's a pinprick to a balloon, and the whole thing unravels. So long run, that doesn't help anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's kind of the comparison has been made that the people who say you disagree, you're just fragile, white fragility, or you're a privilege preserving epistemic pushback or something like that. And it's basically the equivalent of you want to live a life of sin. Oh, you won't subscribe to my belief system because you want to live a life of sin. It's that psychologizing in a way to sort of dismiss people so they don't have to actually defend the positions. Again, that's bad for both. It's bad for the critics like us, but it's also bad for the people themselves, because they don't really get to think through their beliefs and really develop them to withstand all this scrutiny and criticism.
Yeah.
Sure. So for the next section, I wanted to sort of, again, go back into how theory doesn't understand liberalism, how a lot of these ideas are not really progressive. As far as I'm concerned at that point, this is just, as far as I'm concerned at this point, that's just a buzzword. I mean, a lot of these are rehashed ideas, as we've been saying. Identity politics goes back to tribalism, skepticism, which is healthy in degrees, but there's no reason to be skeptical of everything. Subjectivism is not new. A lot of these are just rehashed ideas. I mean, they may be applied to different groups and for different reasons, but they're not particularly innovative or doing anything groundbreaking. They've just been framed in such a way. So if you notice with me, for example, again, that's another one of those words. I only use it. I basically mock it because it doesn't apply as far as I'm concerned. And one very good book I like is Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, where he talks about the progress of the Enlightenment, all the things that we've been discussing, and how this did lead to genuine progress, human flourishing, science, better life expectancy, et cetera, and how it's really important to understand these values, how these did lead to all these things, and that all these things that are currently being espoused would likely take us in the opposite direction. I know Ayn Rand like to call them neo-mystics, and people hear that and they say, like, what does that mean? But then, as we keep saying, well, if the stuff has a similar structure to a religion, you're just creating a new religion. You're rejecting reason, you're rejecting science, rationality. You're taking us back. It's just taking a different form.
Yeah. There's also something that Mises mentions, where he's talking about the difference when economics came to be, and then he might go into this more as I get into the book, but they seemed to be a connection or a reaction to some of these social sciences, to some of almost critical theory, pre-critical theory, or pre-postmodernism. That was a reaction to econ, saying, "Oh no, it's too rational. That's too exact. Like you can't break down human beings to this the decisions."
You're talking about logical positivism, right?
Yeah, he's talking about there's all these other things that are in there. Human beings are actually souls, or they have these little interactions that you can't just say, "Oh, this person did this because they thought this was better." Whereas for me, and maybe this is just the way my brain works, as I said, if somebody said suggest one book for somebody to read, and I could be told this would be a book that everybody who read it would understand the content in that book as I understand it myself, it will be Man, Economy, and State hands down. So maybe I look at things in a rigid, objective type of way, and that doesn't really fit. I'm not spiritual enough. I don't care enough. I'm not emotional enough. I'm not thinking about people's lived experience enough and things like that. You might want to define me as that way, but that stuff, I think it makes sense of why, if you understand this stuff, you understand why things are the way that they are. You understand why things don't go right the way they are. And I think it's a good basis to say, okay, how can we actually work on things in the future, taking into account what has been listed in Man, Economy, and State and so far in Human Action. Yeah.
Well, again, I think I mentioned this in a previous video, but also bear in mind, praxeology is the study of purposeful human action. It's the what.
Yeah.
Why people do things, that's psychology. That's a separate field. What should people do? That's a question of ethics. How people do things, that's technology. We can have all those other conversations, but again, this is just focused on this person, again, spends money now on this thing because they believe the thing will make them better off than holding that money. The person saves money because they believe the money will benefit them in some way more in the future. Those are praxeological truths. If those are wrong, I'm willing to hear explanations for why. But again, if you get into, oh, well, why do people save more than others? What should people save money? Again, those are other disciplines, but we're just
Yeah.
focused on this is the purposeful human action. This is why.
And the reason I consider these are to be the
Yeah.
important things to understand about society is because when it comes down to it, and you go talk to other people with praxeology, you're talking about
Mm.
what actually is, and what you actually see and is. It doesn't matter why that person hit that person. That person hit that person. You know? And then if you talk to that person about why they hit that person, they could lie to you. They could honestly think that person is the devil. Is that
Yeah.
person the devil? No, that person isn't the devil. And he also talked about that. I always talk about in the past, you look at certain things, and there was doctors who would say, "Oh, this person is ill. What are we actually going to look into it? Is it because they feel this way? Is it because they went to this place? Is it because a witch wished bad on this person?" Hundreds of years ago, those were things a doctor would consider. But it was not true then, it is not true now, and it's not something a doctor today would consider. So when it comes to praxeology, when it comes to the econ in general, I think for me I've gone around, and the whys of why people do certain things, or the structures we should create to enable as many people to be able to do the positive things and the things they want to do in the world,
Yeah.
those are things that are more practical. Those are things that is what it is. Now, the whys and all those things that go behind it, those have their place into it, but those are things that are a lot more subjective and harder to get, because the people themselves might not even have all the whys into it, as we have certain instinctual things that are involved into our certain behaviors and things like that. So, yeah.
And some of the arguments against this I find to be self-refuting because they'll say things like, "Oh, people aren't rational." It's like, okay, but if we acknowledge that, that's an argument for a decentralized economy. Because then,
Yeah.
as you, in your example earlier, people make errors that affects them and a few other people. If it's one decision that affects everybody, okay, everyone has to deal with that bad decision.
Yeah.
So I don't really see that's a case for everyone having less power, not more. I don't really understand that argument.
Yeah.
So
I think,
anyway,
like, sorry, as we mentioned, I think people get to the point where we also do have to understand that individualism is there. I think it's able for people to just keep it to the individual, keep it to themselves, and see, like, okay, in this situation, it's still my rational benefit somehow if this person gets in, because I will still benefit, and I am able to ignore all the negative effects. And I think I just posted a status like this where it's like, okay, if one life dies, if it only saves one life, we need to do it. We need to shut down the society because it's for the greater good. Or we just need to focus on that one life that it saves. And then on the inverse, that one person you mentioned is like, oh, the problem is your rugged individualism. And that's what we talked about before, how if it's my lived experience, then there seems to be an aspect of individualism there. And I think this is something we've discussed that we're both trying to do is they seem to be talking about the general things that make us individualists and make us value that. Yet
yeah,
there is a disconnect to accepting individualism.
yeah.
It's weird. It's something in there.
Again, if anyone has any good explanations for that, I'm willing to hear it, but I have yet to hear
Yes.
any. Yeah. So anyway, moving on. There's a section here called liberal science. It's this journalist named John Rauch, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, wrote a defense of liberalism in 1992 called Kindly Inquisitors, the New Attacks on Free Thought. He talked about knowledge production, which he called liberal science. So liberal science applies two consistent rules, the skeptical rule and the empirical rule. He summarizes these as no one gets the final say and no one has personal authority. He argues these peculiar rules are two of the most successful social conventions the human species has ever evolved. And then why is that? He goes on to say those two rules define a decision making system that people can agree to use to figure out whose opinions are worth believing. And it works because the system may not fix the outcome in advance or for good. There's no final say, and it may not distinguish between participants. Nobody has personal authority. So he contrasts what he calls the liberal principle, which I'll get into a sec, with four others. The four other principles are called the fundamentalist principle, the simple egalitarian principle, the radical egalitarian principle, and the humanitarian principle. So the fundamentalist principle is those who know the truth should decide what is right. That's the basis for totalitarianism and theocracy, as we've talked about. These people know the best, so they make the decisions. A word I saw in that Magnus essay I didn't know was epistocracy. I like that word. Epi, it's from the Greek word for knowledge, and ocracy, ruled. So it's a. I think the original term was a government ruled by the people who know how. So it's that sort of idea, and What's that?
Intelligentsia. The Illuminati and the intelligentsia, kind of
Yeah.
like the W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington saying like the chosen
Yeah.
10% who know better give us the money and it will empower the black people.
Yeah.
Uh,
So there's the simple egalitarian principle that's all sincere persons' beliefs have equal claim to respect. That's sort of the equivalent you see today where people will say, oh, this person means well, this person has good intentions. It's kind of the equivalent of that. There's the
wrong.
rat.
Charlie Murphy, wrong.
There's the radical egalitarian principle, which is the same as the last one, but this applies to groups or classes. Of course, that's basically what we've been talking about. And then lastly, there's a humanitarian principle, which is it can take any of these above, but the priority is to make sure no one gets hurt or offended. So of course that's the basis for censorship and other things, and that's where they use justifications like epistemic violence, epistemic injustice, all that. That's where that comes from, because the idea is we can't hurt anyone at all costs, which I personally find ridiculous, but some people consider that a good idea. And then the liberal principle, as he defines it, it's the checking of each by each through public criticism is the only legitimate way to decide who is right. So again, that goes to all things we've been saying about science. Ideas get put out there. If they're wrong, they get criticized. If the criticisms fail, we hold on to them. If somebody proves them wrong, that paves the way for the next progress. And personally, I again, after saying all this and just in general, I don't really see any good arguments for censorship or against freedom of speech. It all seems to come down to we don't want to be offended, or we want to be the people who decide what can be said. And I don't think there's any example historically of that panning out well, and I can't see any reasons logically it would either. Again, if anyone has any arguments against what I'm saying, feel free, but I have yet to find any. Any thoughts or comments, Silas?
um, what is the? So you were saying these are the liberal parts?
So the liberal principle is the checking of each by the each, but then the author says that these
Why
four
liberal?
other. Sorry.
Why liberal?
Well, because it's the classical liberal idea, the idea of checking of each by the each. That's the original. No, the checking of each by the each. That's the liberal principle. The other four are at odds with it. That's what he's saying.
Okay.
The other four are at odds with all of those, and that we lose freedom when those things become implemented, because that's the basis for censorship, totalitarianism, or what have you.
Okay, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So he wasn't saying those are parts of being a liberal.
No.
These are actually things that are against. These are things that stand in the way of actually truly being liberal in the sense of what the word did once mean, and I hope possibly can still be returned to meaning. In the near future. Yeah. Okay.
So I was going to now go again over the postmodern principles and themes again, and sort of in light of what we're talking about, and show how they're at odds. So social justice theory does have kernels of truth and acknowledges real problems. And I think that's something we really need to emphasize, because what some conservatives do, I think they make the mistake, is that they try to ignore certain problems like disparities between races or things like that. And I think that becomes its own sort of religion, where it's like you deny certain things just for sticking it to the libs or whatever. And I think we have to have that honest discussion, but do it in a rigorous methodological way. And I think I'm willing to concede that some of these postmodern ideas are right in certain areas, but if the methodology is still bad, it's going to get criticized and rejected. Yeah. So for example, the knowledge principle about knowledge is socially constructed. Again, different cultures evolve differently. People do have prejudices and biases baked into them, but at the same time, that necessitates more dialogue, not less, because that's how those prejudices and biases come to light. A few people deciding what's true for everyone doesn't help with that at all. I'm also reading another book written by Harry Binswanger. I don't know if you know who he is. He works at the Ayn Rand Institute. It's a book about epistemology. It's a really big book. I've only just begun. It's about 600 pages, but he gets into reason. He gets into rationalism versus empiricism in it. He gets into the sort of the Kantian turn, all that. It's pretty interesting, but I definitely believe that reason is the ultimate means to knowing reality. Reason and evidence is the best way for knowing. Again, we can keep refining that. We make errors. I make errors, but that's necessity for more dialogue. The confidence in confidence in science and reason is valuable. They try to say it's naive and evil. Again, I don't see the case for that. science isn't supposed to be white, Western, imperialist, or whatever. It's universal, something anyone can use. And Foucault was right about science being misapplied to certain things, like Thaddeus Russell always brings up about eugenics and things like that. But again, that's more earlier stages of science, and that's errors that people made. Those things have to be questioned, and of course they have been. That's why we don't believe them anymore. And I'm fine with listen and consider or listen and investigate, but I'm not into this whole listen and believe, or it's often shut up and listen and believe. Again, I still don't see any good arguments for that. Anyone's free to try and change me. So any thoughts on that? Or
Oh, the reason, what's the definition you're using here? Reason, the power of the mind to think, understand, and form judgments by a process of logic.
Well, you using integrating the material provided by the senses. That's the definition I like. Yeah, because it's because it's percepts, which it's like you see something, you don't know what it is. Okay, that's a color. Well, what is a color? You learn what a color is, and okay, what is green? That's green. Things like that, and then okay, various shades. What's that?
Breaking down things that you've observed and you've taken in and analyzed. Yeah.
Knowledge is hierarchical, as she likes to say, as far as, again, what is a color? Then that's green. Then, okay, is that dark green? Well, what is dark? What is light? And you tie all these things together, but you keep adding, you understand the basic concept, and then you expand accordingly.
Yeah, because there's also the whole reason thing where it's just a reason, something you provide. Oh, what you do there? Oh, this is my reason. And there's good reasons and bad reasons. And they go into the whole thing with like the belief system where someone says, "Oh, I believe in X. Why do you believe in X?" Oh, because this book that first brought up the idea of X says X is right. I'm like, wait, the book that invented X says X is right, and that's why you think X is right? Like that's a reason. it's evidence. It's evidence to back your claim, but it's not a good reason. It's not a solid reason. It's not a reasonable reason. It's not. I don't think the expectation.
It's not a valid reason.
Yeah, it's. I don't know if it's invalid. How would it be invalid? Why would you consider it invalid?
Well, some of my criticisms with this, as we keep saying, it's the methodology. It's how did you arrive at certain numbers? Like if you tell me women earn 77 or 80 cents or whatever for every dollar a man earns, well, how did you get at that? They just say, well, it's discrimination. And I say, well, wait a minute, you have to factor in.
Okay.
Yeah. So things like that. It's, and I think, and he talks a little bit about this early on in the book. Well, Binswanger does, I mean, where rationalism versus empiricism, how this is why we kind of need both, because it's he argues, as Rand did, of course, that the mind and body dichotomy is false, and that we need both of these, because you need to know the data is valuable, but at the same time, how did you arrive at that data? That's the other side of it. Okay. Like, so because praxeology deals with purposeful human action, they were just the consequences of things stemming from human action, but then they would argue, though, I know that certain things you have to test empirically. Like I think Hoppe's example was, which fast food restaurants do children prefer? You can't reason your way to that. You have to go out and collect data. There's certain things that you have to test empirically. But again, how did you arrive at that data? Like in my example just now about pay, or the one you made in the previous conversation about Black people got charged more for certain crimes, but then it's okay. Well, wait a minute. Did those people have previous records? What were the states they were in? Did some people plead out and get lesser sentence? Like all those factors, tying all those things together, all that context, that would explain the number. And I think what it is that people latch on to certain numbers that are misleading because it fits certain preconceptions or because they want to believe it. That's what I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this, in the case of this book and the belief, it would be invalid because that's also the same source that invented it. But if you said it was someone else told you about that thing that was invented in that book, of course, but that would be valid even though not a good reason.
Yeah, I would say the methodology for arriving at that is faulty. So I guess that would be errors in reasoning, we'd say. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But again, to keep going back to that point, that's why that necessitates dialogue. Like with the pay gap thing, if someone brings that up, I say why it's wrong, and then they can decide if I'm wrong, push back against me. If I'm right, if I'm right and they're reasonable, they'll say, okay, he makes a good point. But it's also what you do with that information, I would say. Yeah.
Okay.
So the postmodern political principle, I think, needs to be rejected. It basically sees power struggles and everything. Did you hear? I think you heard the Coleman Hughes talk where he made the analogy with the beer bottle.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to explain it for those who didn't listen, James Lindsay said how a lot of these arguments are like a conspiracy theory without conspirators. And the argument he made is that he was almost clipped, I guess, walking home one day with his wife by a car, and there was a beer bottle on the ground. And he was saying, if I had tripped on that bottle and gotten hit by the car, and someone were to say, well, we live in a society that glorifies alcohol use, which led to that bottle being there, which led to him tripping, which led to his death. He was saying you can see how that follows, but it's like a long-winded kind of a stretch to make. And he was saying, but that's what the arguments a lot of these postmodernists are making. There's disparities. Yeah. Well, because this person way back made this law, which did this. And it's like, okay, you can see where it's coming from, but in the present day, it's like, it's not like it's not like with the Marxian thing where people are actively working to hold people back. No, it's,
it's a butterfly effect type of thing. I mean, we are all connected in a sense. So I don't think we need to enshrine like more centralized kind of organizations, because we already have certain controls.
Yeah.
Me and Stephen having this conversation in the whole economic kind of aspect of it, there's many other things we could have been doing that could have been positive for other people's lives in certain ways. And that's what I'm saying. This also goes on with the religious aspect of it. In Exodus 20, from the Ten Commandments, talks about how God is a jealous God that is more than happy to punish people punish the son for sins that the father did. He said up to 3 or 4 generations. I guess that depends on the sin or on hating God. If you hate God, then 3 or 4 generations can be punished. That's something that goes in line with the postmodernist critical theories. They look at, oh, your ancestors did this, we can still be punished. You take it further back to the original sin, which is not something that was invented by the Christians, but has been popularized by them more than any other religion. But that is the thing. Literally, the first human beings did this, and all humans are now bad.
Yeah.
So that whole idea is purely there. But then how far do you reasonably go? Again, like being reasonable, thinking about reason, just going into understanding certain things. Like, another thing we're talking about, why I like the United States of America, it's reasonable to say people should speak as much as possible, have as much information. Another one is the guilty, the innocent are proven guilty. That presumption of innocence is another reasonable thing, but that is not something that humans have not been this reasonable for most of society. Like, I just had a story of somebody who's like my best friends, somebody who my mom's best friends, one of my mom's best friends, husband's sister had a kid. And she's helped us a lot. Like I know this person, if I saw on the street, I know this person. It's a tough thing. Her son got stoned to death like a week ago. Like, she actually was taken to the site, and she went there and she found him, and she was holding him in her arms as after he had been stoned to death. The lynch mob was still there, and she was just saying, "What do you do? What do you do for this? Stop doing this." And this is a typical behavior. This is in the Bible. Oh, that person had relations with somebody outside of marriage or before marriage. Stone them. Take them out to the gates and stone them. People still do that right now, and this is completely. It seems completely unreasonable. But then, what were those people thinking? Like, I go to that point and I think, the people who stoned this person to death, for whatever reason that they didn't actually even present, that I don't know of, but it's like, what reason would you personally need to have for that to be valid? And then, do those people just go home and sleep? People are like, oh, I can't believe, how does Trump sleep at night when doing all these things? Because the world they're looking at is that kind of world. How does somebody sleep after stoning someone to death? It's just, they're just like, people don't understand, like, that whole idea of just being reasonable. We are in the best time that we know about. And we need more communication. We need presumption of innocence. We need people to be able to talk and communicate. And it's on, I don't know, a nice age. It's like the knife edge of like a quantum sized knife. Like that's where we're at on some of these things.
Yeah.
I still do think, even if we lose the chance to explode into this next level of human flourishing where some of these things have just gone to the past, I'm not saying, oh, we're going to go back to Hammurabi times and things like that, where we're just like, oh, chopping people's arms off, like where it's either flying in space or that. I still think there's places we won't go back to in certain
Yeah.
places, but we also have to realize how marvelous and how on the nice edge using things like reason are so much better tools than some of this irrational things that are being pushed by critical theory, and it's not much better than the things we've been doing for, at least from what I see, the practical effects of the practical applications of critical theory are advocating for things not much better, a few steps away from the most horrific ways that people have been living for eternity. That's kind of my main reason of why we're having these conversations. Yeah.
I think of what Rand said about when you abandon reason, it's faith or force, and that's basically the direction they're taking us in. And as we've been discussing for these last several conversations, there's plenty of both in there. There's plenty of things to be taken on faith, and many of these people, I don't doubt they'd be willing to use violence against their opponents, and that leads us to, and those two, especially those two together, lead us to a very scary place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But as we're talking about with the interactions of what people should do, and that whole thing of, oh, I think that person should do this in a different way. Like when I heard this story, I was thinking, what if I had actually gone into more and got my chefing it up site up and things like that? And I was like, okay, with the chefing it up site, we've now collected more people in Kenya around who can cook, and then now we have more people connection. And then this person, she's a caterer herself, was involved in the site, and then maybe she could have earned a bit more money. Then maybe she would have been able to pay for the school fees for the son, and the son would have been in this location. Like I could think of ways where there's different things I could have personally done that might have affected that situation. But should I be responsible for that situation? Should I hold myself responsible for that? I can say like, oh, maybe going forward, I can look at that and say maybe I should do certain positive things better. They might have knock-on effects, but some horrible things you've done might have actually led to somebody being very well. Like that whole bottle situation.
Yeah.
Somebody might he pointed out the thing where, oh, we've encouraged an environment where we have a society where people are pro drinking, and that's why the bottle is there. It could be an inverse. It could have been one person that's against drinking, and their son was drinking on the street, and then they came by and slapped that bottle out of their son's hand and said, "You're not drinking anymore. I'm taking you to rehab." And that son now, from that point, went on and then had the kid that invented the cure for cancer because he met his future wife at this rehab institution, and then that ended up. And that could be why that same bottle is there that Lindsay tripped on and then dies.
Yeah.
So that exchange could happen because there's so many things where if you just get bogged down with all that information, and that's happened to me sometimes because my brain just never stops. Like it just keeps going and going and going, where you can get bogged down with some of these things. And there was something you said in the recent video. It was something about garbage ideas or garbage intellectuality. I don't know what the term when you were talking about what the actual field is, we were talking about how convoluted some of this stuff is. I don't know. There was a term garbage intellectualizing or something like that.
Yeah.
Where it's like,
maybe.
why are you even thinking about this?
Oh,
like,
mental masturbation, you mean?
Yeah, it was something like that. Yeah. Where I could seriously sit here and think of thousands of different storylines of how me doing something different 10 years ago could have affected this individual being stoned.
Yeah.
But what is the purpose of me actually doing that? And I see that with some of these. What is the purpose of really going into a lot of what we've talked about in this critical theory? Like, what is the tool? Why are we doing this?
Yeah, I mean, I have nothing against exercise and thought, but again, if you're talking about hard science and other things, there's a specific goal in mind. Oh, we want to understand subatomic particles. We want to cure this disease. This, I don't really see what the end goal is aside from mental masturbation.
Yeah.
So I was going to say with the political thing that it is true that people are born into cultures that shape their beliefs, but this idea that like somehow people are expected to act according to them is just absurd. And this is where we get mad at things like authentic experiences. I mean, the idea that you're going to say this person is in this category, so they're going to act this way, that's very prejudicial in of itself. And I don't want to speak for other people, but I'm sure other people would find that offensive. And I find it to be simplistic. Like when, oh, this person is of this race, so they're supposed to have this opinion on this issue. And then it's like, what? You don't agree with that? And it's like, look, they're individuals. They can form their own opinions. They may agree with me, they may not, but they as individuals have a right to do that. And this idea that there's an authentic experience that certain people decide what's true, I just consider it a garbage idea. And I another thing I haven't really heard any good cases for.
Yeah. And then also, just a small addition, this
Yeah.
one thing that before I was starting to get into more the idea of understanding individualism, understanding some of these things, and
Yeah.
getting into more of these other theoretical things, was somewhere like Michael Jackson. I would look at Michael Jackson, and people were like, "Oh, that's one weird guy. He's climbing in the trees, thinking he's Peter Pan. He's getting into all this makeup, and
Yeah.
he looks all different and things like this. He's an odd fellow." But then I watched this documentary about his childhood, and I was like, "Wow, that is really creepy." Like
Yeah.
his older brothers are in their teens in the Jackson Five, and they're sharing a hotel, and then they have groupies coming into the room to have relations with, and then these other groupies are fangirling on Michael, and it's not just like, oh, Instagram where I can just like follow this person and send them occasionally weird things. It's like, no, we're actually sneaking into this 5-year-old's hotel room and sneaking into the bed with him. Like, think about the kind of messed up things that happens to somebody. His parents were abusive, like both physically
Yeah.
and mentally. You have to do all this work. And I was thinking, okay, if you take, like, again, with that made me understand what was happening with Michael Jackson. Didn't mean I thought it was positive, but it's more understandable. I was like, if you take 100 human beings and subject them to as close to a life as Michael Jackson actually lived, then maybe, and he had the same genetic makeup, same kind of things in general, maybe what he turned out to was the norm from that sort of experience. It's just
Yeah.
that his experience was so different from the average experience people have that it makes him so abnormal
Yeah.
compared to the general things. And then when you take that kind of thing, that's why you can say, even though he's an individual that reacts to this in an individual way, as he's a human being, he's been subjected to certain effects. So if you get a group of individuals and subject them to an area in a certain culture that speaks a certain way, eats a certain food, values a certain things, there's going to be observations you can make about this group. Oh, this race and this culture, this ethnicity, when exposed to these things, react in this certain way. For hundreds of years, those things were developed.
Yeah.
Now, if you take those black people and you put them where the white people were, and you take those white people and put them where the black people were, over those 100 years at tabula rasa, the behavioral patterns that the white people have in this location would be what the black people have.
Yeah.
And the behaviors that the black people had from being in this location would be what the white people have. So I can still make those observations about the groups of individuals subjected to certain environments, but doesn't mean it's somehow coded into these people. Like if you change the actual environment or the background of the black person, they will still behave exactly like them because they are the black person. So that's I think a discrepancy that is tough to make when you start going to. I think for some people, at least for me, I think it was a challenge to bridge those gaps together. Where it's like, yes, the individual is the ultimate thing decider, but there's still a collectivist. There's still observations that can be made about collections of people.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. But again, it's the key that people are not beholden to certain cultures, like you talked about previous beliefs you had, how you no longer have them. Same for me. It's like there's nothing written in stone. Okay, you're born into this culture. You have to believe this until you die. And I feel like with that gentleman from Iraq, Faisal, I'm trying to think, the one who's on Dave Rubin's show, but same thing, where people assume, oh, you're a Muslim, you hate the West and all that. And of course, it's not true. But when he grew up in Iraq under Saddam Hussein and left, and because he was exposed to new information, his ideas changed accordingly. And then again, they would say like, oh, well, you're a victim of colonialism, or you're looking at things through a Western lens, or whatever
Yeah.
they would say, whatever they call it. But again, it's like, no, it's just an individual who grew up in a certain culture, had certain ideas, and he went to another culture and he changed his mind accordingly. Huh.
Yeah, and
No.
the thing is, going back to what we're talking about, also is history is history.
Yeah.
Like you look at something, I was trying to go through a book, and I was like, all right, it's like I said, my favorite genre is sci-fi, and I think occasionally I'll go back into things like hard econ type of things, like academic things. But I tried listening to a book about the Templars. I'm like, it's kind of boring. I don't really care. But when you look at that time with the Templars, something that could also inform that is somebody in the West might have some kind of connection to the Templars and things like that, and think, oh, these immigrants coming in, they've hated us. We've been at war with them since antiquity because of our God and our Jesus and the Mount and Temple on the Mount and Darius Volt, and it's a meme, but for some people it's a lot more serious, and that will inform the way that they look at that history. But then on the inverse, I was like reading about this stuff, and this stuff is all based in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So for those people, they've actually been being invaded by people from Europe for centuries.
Yeah.
Like if they're going from their history, they're like, I have a great 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 grandfather who was killed by you guys. I have a great 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 grand aunt that was raped by you guys. I have like this location in this land where my great 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 like uncle was living, was taken away and then given to this duchy and given to this thing to find this thing. So for them, that also informs it. And I wish we could understand that is all our shared history.
Yeah.
And maybe it's easier for me to see because I'm not Arab. I'm not European, or don't have those. I'm not Caucasian. So I'm not coming into those feeling some kind of longer connection to all these things. I don't consider myself Christian. I'm not Muslim. So I don't have this collectivist identification to all these other things. And I think that's what we're talking about with the individualism thing, where there'll be somebody who will be Christian and individualist and an individualist personally, but then stay as a Christian and then adopt all these affectations and insults and struggles of what it means to be a Christian. And I think you see a similar thing. Somebody will say, as a gay person, as a black woman, they'll absorb that identity with all its affectations and all its past injustices and past wins in history. It's like, and then that's a weird thing that people still do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So blurring of boundaries, I was going to say how I do think we should question boundaries and categories, but of course this doesn't mean radical skepticism of everything. James Lindsay had an example when there was the whole 2+2 thing, and he had people saying things like, well, are things really identical? And it's like, okay, if you hold up two apples, yeah, they may look a little different, but we put them in a general category. There's a reason we put things into categories, courtesy of Aristotle. And he said, he was even saying too, like if you break it down in physics, if you look at elemental particles, there are elemental particles that are identical. So when people are saying like, well, no two things in nature are exactly the same, one, that's not true, and two, what does this add? You're making it convoluted and confusing for what purpose? And
some of those very same people will also be the kind of people who will say all gay people are subjected to the same struggle.
Yeah.
I'm like, no, you just said no two things are okay, but why are you saying this whole every gay person is the same?
Yeah. Or black people this, black people that. But hey, don't stereotype. It's like, well, wait a minute. Anyway, I would say queer theory is probably one of the worst areas on this. Of course, you could watch our video on that if you want a rehashing of that. But that and fat studies were like the two weirdest chapters to read for me. I was just like, people actually like write whole journals on this.
It's a rather queer thing, isn't it? But maybe that's part of it, because queer theory itself, it's going to be queer because it is queer theory. It's about queer theory. So
but you can also queer theory too.
Yeah. And then with fat studies, it's studying people who have taken an excess of information beyond the basic amount of information they need to be useful. So you're taking extra calories. So the whole field itself is extra. Like way extra stuff. We shouldn't be talking about this stuff. Yeah.
So the power of language. I personally find etymology very interesting, like where words come from and why.
It's a fantastic field.
And I do think it's very interesting, but again, I don't see the reason. This sort of ties in the freedom of speech thing. I don't see the reason to explain that these words are negatively impacting this person, or these words are this violence. The power of language thing is just the postmodern whole view of it. I pretty much reject completely. Like it's one of those things where, as I said, I think in the first introduction video, it's like you're creating these new meanings in the words for the sake of being convoluted and trying to be interesting or something. I don't really see. Yeah.
But at the same way, understanding etymology, like some of the words, I think it's like, I think one of the ones we've commiserated over for some time is anarchy. I think for me that one's gone. I need to think of a different term. Maybe I just say like I'm an individualist. I'm an individualist supporter of free markets. Like the term anarcho-capitalist just doesn't mean anything anymore. It's just I don't think it can be. It maybe was too young of a term. Anarchy is a lot older of a term, but capitalist is so new of a term, but so convoluted and so different. bringing the two together just it's unless you're talking to other people who identify as anarcho-capitalists in the sense in like libertarian circles, it does more harm than good to
Yeah.
identify yourself like that in a public arena. There's so much more bias against it, and other people define it in so different ways that
Yeah.
No.
So, well, I was going to say with some of the other etymologies they play around with, like when they try to say like we need to redefine master bedroom because that's offensive, and it's like that had nothing to do with slaves. There's or there's I think I might have brought it up in a previous video, but the whole thing from Legally Blonde about we have to change the name semester because this is patriarchal oppression. I'm having it named ovester, but the word semester, it comes from the Latin word for six, meaning 6 months. So it doesn't even have anything to do with like
Yeah.
it's just all these things like this where again it really is the mental masturbation thing of like I don't see you're writing these power dynamics into all this language sometimes which doesn't even exist if you look at the actual words.
Try to convince people and tell them about how girl used to be what like boys were called, what male children were called. If you can say like girl power is actually patriarchy's attempt to sneak back like power of boys in over girls, like because like, that whole different. I think it was just kids in general would just call them girls. But yeah, this etymology, it's interesting. It's something that's kind of like a party thing. Like, oh, you're sitting around and talking about certain things, but it might not have that much purpose.
Cultural relativism, I won't spend too much time on this, but basically that different cultures do things differently. Some could argue better or worse, but reason and science are supposed to transcend cultures. Like even if a culture didn't use science as much in the past, well, no one says they can't now. You can keep, I mean, the way I see it is you could have the best of both worlds. You could take reason, take science, use them absolutely, but at the same time, look, if you want to keep local styles of dress, music, I don't see anything wrong with that. Those are just questions of preference, but the I don't see any reason to reject reason and epistemology as racist or whatever. You can still be who you are. It's like you don't have to reject solid epistemology.
Yeah. And I mean, because this is one thing, the people who are out there saying my name, talking about whether you agree, I don't agree with what LeBron James says. Again, with these words, depending on, he might mean something else by the word hunt. When he says black people are being hunted by police or we're being hunted by police, when he says, "Oh, I'm afraid to be a black man in this world," and then he lives in Beverly Hills, that's like 95% white, and these kids are going to those schools. I don't know if he's literally afraid for his child in the same sense that the person I spoke about here. I don't know if she even had the fear that her son could be stoned to death without some due process. But when they're saying we want a world where the police aren't doing this to us, because they understand, they think there's a better way to do things. So they understand there's a better culture in order to do that. A better culture, maybe not saying necessarily white culture, but they think there's a better way to have a culture than what's going on right now. Like I can clearly say, I would rather live in a culture where there's not a chance that I'm going to be told that somebody I know had a relative stoned to death by a lynch mob.
Yeah.
Without due process. And I don't think this is a story that would come up in the West. I don't think living in America, like, I don't think if I was living in America, that would have been a story that I would hear. Like part of even what made me, and this might be, maybe it's an equivalent, part of the things that made me kind of leave the United States of America and get, I think one of the key things that launched me in this whole what are cultures, what are societies, why do people run things this way? I think it was coming more into adulthood from just taking things for granted back when I was in college. One of my friends was living in the DC area. He was on the football team and he was involved in some of the inner city DC things. Supposedly this is the story we heard, oh, he's been shot dead. And we're like, what's going on? We were going to school in West Virginia at this time. And this is in DC. He'd gone back home for just some short vacation. Apparently, he'd driven his friend's car to one of the bars, one of the clubs, and his friend owed some other people some money.
Ooh.
And they saw his car and they got an altercation in the actual bar. His friend wasn't even there. And then supposedly they left after, and the people followed him, like, oh, that's the friend's car. And one car stopped in front of him, another car stopped behind him, got out guns, automatic weapons, shot the cars up, the guy died.
Wow.
And this was what was happening there. This probably didn't make the news, just like right now, this stoning of this person didn't make the news for whatever reason. Didn't make international news, of course. The George Floyd thing did, but it didn't make international news. But I think if somebody was stoned, if this person was stoned and not shot to death by other black people, I think that would have made international news because of the stoning. But anyway, so those two incidents, I was talking to people in West Virginia. They hunt, they have guns, they live with that thing on a daily basis, but they couldn't envision living. It was hard for them to like, wait, feel like the cops are not going to find that person. Like, no, no. Some of my friends who lived, some of my friends, Black Americans who lived in the inner city areas, lived in that same area, were trying to explain, like, nah, that stuff happens. He
Yeah.
was probably like the fourth person shot that weekend.
Well, yeah.
Like, the police are not going to actually find this person. People in West Virginia were like, what are you talking about? Like,
Yeah.
if somebody gets shot here, the cops are at that person's house because chances that person are known, they know the gun
Yeah.
registered, all these things. Like, they couldn't understand
Yeah.
that. And right now I'm trying to think, like, how would I explain to people, like, this person who got stoned, nobody's going to be arrested.
Yeah.
Probably not going to be a single arrest. Probably not going to find out what this person actually did. But like how do you explain that? And to try to pretend that each three, so the environment in West Virginia, security wise, the environment in the DC at that time, security wise, the environment where this person got stoned, security wise, are all just relatively the same. No, there's differences with the cultures in those different areas. And I can expressly say, for security wise, from doing something and having your life threatened from those three locations, the West Virginia one is better in all general objective sense, in all reasonable sense of what the term better is. It's better to be there in those places. And that's just, people need to be more realistic about these things.
Well, I wanted to sort of talk about the whole Me Too thing for a second, because I thought that was part of a good conversation between when James Lindsay was talking to Megan Murphy. How they were saying how, look, there are serious concerns here. Like, they talk about rapists that don't get tried, rapists that get away, certain powerful men get away with certain things because the women are afraid of the consequences. Of course, things like Weinstein and how many other places, like I know with Fox News, there's the whole thing with Megyn Kelly and Roger Ailes, all of that. So there were valid complaints here, but the problem was, it was one of those things where, like, initially these people who were coming, the women who were coming out did have valid complaints. Like, they were people like Megyn Kelly or some of Weinstein's victims or all that. But then it became, it went from Me Too to like, oh, Me Too, Me Too. And then it's like, oh, all these things happened to me. And then Megan Murphy was saying how she started asking people like, hey, what happened? And it was like, oh, a creeper hit on me. Oh, a guy I didn't like asked me out. Oh, a drunk guy at a bar hit on me. But this is why we have due process and innocent still proven guilty. Because if all these things had been made in actual trials, like if Believe All Women became a real thing, how many people would be in jail just based on these words? There's a reason we have due process. Now, again, this doesn't mean the system is perfect. Obviously, yeah, I don't want to see rapists get away. But at the same time, if we just go by people's words, this could be weaponized in 2 seconds. Oh, my boss raped me 5 years ago. Oh, this former friend raped me. Oh, my ex, it's where anyone could use that. And I don't have enough emphasis on the word faith in human nature to just expect everyone to be honest. If people were completely honest, yeah, that would be a good system, but people aren't. So,
and even, and in addition to that is a part that just makes me, it's not apathetic, but I just don't even take the people seriously. I'm like, you don't really believe that. You don't really believe all women, because when it comes to something like with that Tara Reid situation, whether it happened or not, look at how that was treated.
Yeah.
Look at how, surprisingly, I know the whole Me Too thing was kind of running out of energy a bit, but it got hushed down really quick once that whole, it seems to be around that whole Tara Reid and Joe Biden type of accusing. The whole sniffing of the kids thing. The sniffing of the kids thing is creepy.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see why some people think it's creepy. Like, it's not a good look. If there was, you look at just the basic pictures that Trump has had with his own daughter in just a general friendly sense, and what was being said about those pictures, and then you look at what Joe Biden has had with people who are not his relatives. He doesn't know, just people he just met. And you see their reaction to it, and that's, oh, we're not going to talk about that. You look at that recent thing with that French film from Netflix, with the girls and the dancing. Look how that was treated by certain people with the whole Me Too thing. So it's not consistent. Like, if you are consistent with some of these things, I might not agree with you, but I at least respect consistency. that's one thing I will respect from anyone. Someone is consistency, even if someone is consistently wrong, I'll respect that over somebody that seems to be opportunistically offended, opportunistically active on certain things. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I got fed up too, because the same people believe all women, and like we say, he and other people get accused. Suddenly they're silent. It's like you literally said believe all women. You didn't say believe all women except, and then no.
Yeah.
It's like if you're not going to follow that standard, you have no credibility with me. If you were going to say everyone who gets accused should be looked into at least, okay, again, I may think some of that's overblown, but at least all right, you're being consistent. So. And also, I don't know if you heard this too, but there was something about Biden at Christmas parties, how they didn't want him there because I guess he came on to like Secret Service agents, like wives or
Oh,
girlfriends or
wow.
something. It's like,
And, and with this one, I'm not surprised about this. I'm still shocked by some of these things, but again, part of what I was talking about before with how 25 bad things might have been happening out of 100 in the past, and then now we only hear
yeah,
now this. But back then we heard about one, and then now only 5 out of 100 things happened, but we hear about all 5 in full detail. Politicians were worse in the past.
yeah,
Men in power were a lot worse in the past. If you had the sort of coverage for like John F. Kennedy as
yeah,
you do for Trump, you're just seeing some horrific stuff. The
yeah,
fact
yeah,
that we're hearing about this stuff, it's not like Joe Biden just started being creepy Uncle Joe. He's been in politics for 47 years.
yeah,
You think he might not have entered this way, but halfway through that, there's a 20-year point, he'd already been doing some grimy stuff, but you just weren't hearing about some of those things. Like politicians used to be able to just literally just send someone to kill people. Like
yeah.
that doesn't happen as much anymore, at least in the West. Like it might still happen in certain places. There's still rumors about things like that happening, people being disappeared in Kenya and places like that. But it's not as no. You have the whole Seth Rich scandal, like it's like those things where there's people there's rumors and talks about this. You look at Hollywood, we're talking about that, and all these Me Too movement. Me Too didn't point out something that started becoming worse today.
No,
It was a lot worse,
yeah,
like 100 years ago in Hollywood. When Hollywood was coming out to be, things were a lot worse in the past. There are no good old days.
no.
There's good old quiet days, good old silent days, good old hidden days, but there's no good old days.
Good way to put it. Well, I think of that line from The Godfather too, between Kay and Michael, where Kay says to Michael, "You're being naive," and he says like, "Oh, my father's like a senator or a president, whatever." She goes, "Senators and presidents don't have men killed." He goes, "Who's being naive, Kay?" It's like,
Yeah.
yeah. So let's see here. So next up, I was going to talk about the loss of the individual and the universal. Now, to be fair, certain things are true here that like you can't universalize everything. Hopefully, reason and science, but yeah, there will always be cultural differences, at least to a point. I think, which again, obviously, I'm fine with. If it's just questions of stylistic differences, and but again, as we keep saying, the social justice it focuses so much on group identity. It ignores individual identity. It talks about unique and authentic voices and experiences, which of course it decides. I saw a quote I really liked recently. It goes, they call it critical, but drown themselves in performative fallacy, standpoint paradoxes, and infinite regress due to commitment to class. And it says in parentheses, every class will develop dissent in a subclass and contradict its consistency, both as factual and construct. And I was thinking about you talking about Kenya. You're okay. You're African. You're Kenyan. Then you're a member of this tribe. Then in that tribe, there's hierarchies and things like that. So it's you can't refer to all these as one group because again you keep breaking it down further. Or the best example, I think I might have mentioned it in a previous video with India and the caste system. Like India is not a homogenous society. You have obviously Hindus versus Muslims, but then you have the different castes. You have Dalits, the untouchables. You have Brahmin, the highest. You have the people in between. So you can't say like authentic Indian experience because which one you could be any one of those.
Yeah, and here is where I'm thinking it might be something about depending on the definition of critical. Like this is words, etymology. We're talking about this, the different parts, different aspects of things. We might be focusing on the critical part where it's saying expressing or involving an analysis of the merits or faults works of literature, music, or art, or to just talk about things like that. Somebody else might be focusing more on expressing or disproving comments or judgments where they're more focused on being the critic. And that's why I think for the first cover image on the series, I used the critic who was a character in some animation. It was a cartoon. It was a cartoon,
Right.
yeah, an animation. So he's like the critic. I think for some people, it's more about being a critic rather than focusing on critical aspects of things in society. So they're more focused on I'm the critic. Just like if you're a critic, you're not going to critique every single film made. You're going to be like, oh, I am the critic. I can pick which films I'm going to focus on and talk
Yeah.
about those films and break those films down and all this genre. Where it's not just talking about, oh, critiquing in and of itself, critiquing things in and of itself is important. I think
Well,
that could be a thing where
I was going to say in food service too, like with restaurant critics, like Michelin critics only go to restaurants of a certain caliber. They're not going to eat every fast food chain, all this, and write reviews. They're going to say, I only review these things of this caliber, and I'm the one who's supposedly more qualified to make judgments on it.
yeah.
Yeah.
And okay, you see here, I'm reading the definition here. This is from the Google thing. I should go to somewhere else. Google's okay, I guess.
For this, maybe.
It's passable. I normally go to like Merriam or something like that. Okay, so here it says the first one, expressing adverse or disapproving comments or judgments. Yes, I think a lot of people just like being critical about things. They like being the critics. Number two, expressing or indulging in an analysis of merits and faults of a work or literature, music, art. Yes, I think a lot of people it's all about being critics. That's why things like things have taken up like that. How many YouTube channels are just people responding to other videos, talking bad about other things? How many of them are just people reviewing different things? Oh, we got these toys. Oh, we got these video games. They're crap. They're this. Films. Oh, we're just watching these movies. I think that's a positive thing. Of a situation of problems, the next one, having a potential to become disastrous at some point in crisis. Now, I think this is where it starts getting converted. People just like being critical and then start taking certain things and pretending or acting like these are disastrous.
Yeah.
Whereas I think this is where we start meeting them with our definition of critical, where I'm like, no, when I think about critical, I'm thinking about here, like number 4, relating to or denoting a point of transition from one state to another. So there's that point. And then number 5, maintaining a self-sustaining chain reaction. So a reactor is about to go critical. Number 3 here, so the disastrous part. I think for me, I'm focusing more on disastrous, where I'm saying the things being discussed in critical theory don't really seem that important. They don't really seem like things that would, if we don't talk about this, it's going to lead to disaster. And maybe that's because I have a different world. I'm involved in thinking about different things. I'm involved in a world where people apparently, I can wake up one day and find out that somebody I know had their child stoned.
Yeah.
Yet for other people, maybe for an average fat person, they live in a culture and a society where everything else has been handled to the point where if they don't have an airplane seat made big enough for them, that's something disastrous to the way to their reality tunnel. I don't know. Maybe for them, these things are disastrous because of the comparatively exceptional or limited life that they live in, their lived experience of what existence is. And it's just not for me. Just like I don't think it's critical if the new, what is it, Baldur's Gate 3 or something. I've never played that game.
I'm a huge fan of the series. I might actually get it soon.
Okay, yeah, because I saw you post something about that. Was that Battlegrounds or and I saw it was Baldur's Gate because some other people. Occasionally, I'll go into things or the PlayStation 5 has been released. I don't mind video games. I just don't really have that much time right now or money to afford the stuff. But for some people, that's a key thing. Some people professional gamers. Some people have been playing Baldur's Gate since Baldur's Gate 1. Some people are the people involved in making the game, and it's a thing. So for them, in that environment, they could be critical issues to deal with and analyze about the game. Oh, it's critical that this game has this feature. And they might have actual discussion groups of talking about that.
Yeah.
But for me, I'm like, that's pointless. I don't really care about that. So I think that's what critical theory might be on a global level. But the difference, as we've mentioned before, is Donald Trump is not having to talk about, we need to take out this discussion about Baldur's Gate being taught to our children because that's an actual thing, because it's gotten that far. I think this might be something that, and maybe that's why it's come from these kind of upper middle class white people are well off. There's black people involved in it, but these people who are kind of in the caste system, when you look at it in rather well off places, it's something that they just had hobbies, kind of discussions about their lives, but it's mutated into something much bigger.
Well, like Ibram Kendi, like I say, I mean, he's black, but he was adopted, I think, by white people, right? And he actually changed his name and he went to private schools and all that. So, like, he's not some guy from like inner city Bronx, inner city Baltimore who decided on his own, I'm going to come up with these ideas. No, he's definitely one of the elite, and he gets paid very well for what he does.
Yeah. Like you look at the LeBron Jameses, the Oprahs, Anita Sarkeesians,
Yeah.
Colin Kaepernicks. They've had challenges in their life for sure. LeBron James was a single child.
Yeah.
Oprah, I think she's had a rather difficult background, but she's done so much from that.
Yeah.
Colin Kaepernick, he was adopted by a white family. He went to a pretty good university, became a $1 million athlete, still being paid millions. So they've had actual challenges. Who was the last person? And Anita Sarkeesian, as I said, has seemed to just fail her way up, keep doing these different things and keep getting money, like the feminist frequency things, making a few videos, still getting all this popularity, talking to the UN. I don't know what she's doing right now. But
she came, I think, from like upper middle class. Like, I don't know that she was wealthy, but I forget if it was Sargon of Akkad or someone said they saw her family's home and they said it was pretty nice. Like, it wasn't like mansion, but it was like she came like fairly well off, which doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. And for me, also coming from a background that's not necessarily that badly off, especially when you talk about historically compared to other people, both in Kenya and just the world in general. I have issues that I've gone through in my life, but I understand they're mostly my individual issues that have informed the way I live. And I wouldn't project that onto everybody else, which is part of my shock. Because like when I heard that news about my friend being shot in DC area, I'd lived in the DC area my whole life, but it was in Bethesda, Maryland, which is like one of the richest counties in the United States of America, where to me that was also as shocking. Where I was like, when society's already projected on me that, oh, as a black person in the United States of America, this is your life. I was like, that is not my life. That is as shocking and abhorrent to me as it is to any of my friends who've grown up in small villages in West Virginia. Yeah. Because that's not my life, and it doesn't have to be my life. Like, so this as we've talked about, and again, we're asking the people who are listening to this, whether you support the stuff of critical theory or against it, if you've talked to other people, if you've have some kind of understanding of why you think this has become as big a thing as it is. Why is it being projected onto society like it's actually something that defines anything about the general existence of humanity?
Yeah. I wanted to touch on for a second about what performance fallacy or performative contradiction is. So this was actually an insight of Jürgen Habermas. I don't know if you know who he is, Silas, but he was.
No, I think the first time I heard that.
So he's a German philosopher. He's still alive. He's 91 now, but he was actually one of Hans Hermann Hoppe's mentors. And he's interesting though, because he's sort of born out of the critical theory tradition, but he would criticize the postmodernists as well. And he actually talked about debating Foucault, because I guess they had exchanges back and forth, but they never had like a formal sit down debate. And they talked about doing it, but I think Foucault died in 1984, so it wasn't able to happen. But he basically identified the performative contradiction or performative fallacy, where the nature of something prevents that thing from happening. Like, for example, if a person says, I am dead, well, you can't do that, because to be able to speak, you have to be alive. And if you're alive, you can't say I'm dead. And I think what he was getting at with some of these ideas here, where again, it's like the idea of my truth. Because remember, he was born, that Habermas was coming out of the critical theory school, not postmodernism. So he believed in objective truth. So if somebody says my truth, it's like, well, wait a minute, then how can we go to group identity if it's yours specifically? And I know Hoppe was sort of influenced by this, and later on he got into his argumentation ethics with self-ownership and things like I'm deciding this. Well, you have to be an individual making these decisions. You own yourself, and you can't reduce that further. So when they start getting into the collectivist stuff, they start contradicting it, because I, the individual, decides this. I own myself. I make these decisions. And again, the argumentation, ethics, it's a whole other thing, but it was sort of born out of this. Now, Hoppe obviously went in a way different direction from Habermas being a critical theorist, Hoppe being an anarcho-capitalist. But I know that he was one of his mentors, and he did take aspects of his philosophy to use later.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
and that's a good thing to point out. You can still learn from people you don't necessarily agree with. You don't have to be like, I agree with 100% of what this person did.
Yeah.
You can still look to the past and like, oh, that person kept slaves? Yeah, that sucks, but they still did all these really good things. You can be like, oh, that person believes in this God that I don't believe in. Oh, that sucks. But they still did a lot of good things about math and all. So there's ways to take those things in different aspects. Yeah.
And I think too that Hoppe was actually a Marxist earlier on because of Habermas, but then he was in Rothbard's class and he was just like enamored by Rothbard and he went in that direction. Yeah. So ultimately, as we've been saying, I think this stuff is destructive. It rejects science, it rejects liberalism, it rejects biology, it rejects reason. Again, if we've been harsh in this entire series, somebody feel free to correct us. If we gotten things wrong, feel free to correct us. There were just a few other points, and we'll wrap up. So one of the things the authors talk about is how they worry that this will lead to a right-wing sort of identitarian movement. And I mean, we have seen the alt-right a bit, which like I get, but I don't think that it's prominent enough. Like I think it's different in Europe because in those cultures are, depending on the country, a bit more homogenous. There is more emphasis on the race and all that, like in Hungary or Poland. I think here it's a bit different because of our demographics and also our culture and history. So this is one of those areas I think the authors are a bit off on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's another different thing. It's also the older cultures, they come from a different history with the
Yeah.
different terms and things like that. Etymology goes longer. You look at something like with the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party in the United Kingdom. They're not really just, you can't just switch those over to Republican, Democrat in the United States of America, or whatever conservatives call themselves, or Republicans or liberals call themselves. Those terms do mean different things in different areas. Now you go to something when you talk about the actual expressions of some of these concepts and ideas are a lot more visceral in Europe than they have been. When you call someone a Nazi in Europe, that's a lot more visceral than
Yeah.
calling someone a Nazi in the United States of America, because like they actually still are literal Nazis there,
Yeah.
like who still who came up with the original Nazis, who still went underground and maintained those ideas, and they thought, and then there's neo Nazis and things like that. Whereas, oh, Donald Trump is literally a Nazi. That's
Yeah.
not anywhere close to the same as those actual Nazis that
Yeah.
exist in some place like Germany. So I think yeah, there's things to just think about with the differences in the different places where it's good to establish what it is you mean by what you're saying.
So, brief discussion of solutions. Now, the authors talk about the whole thing about pulling government funding from universities. Now, they would argue this gets into conflicts about government deciding what can and can't be taught. I mean, there already is a bit of that. Of course, I favor privatization of all of this, but that's something we'll get more into in the next video series, because I think this is one of the issues when you try to socialize all this education is that different people have what they believe is right and wrong. In the past, it was a little different because if America was 90 something percent Christian, okay, they don't mind. Most people don't mind prayer in schools and things like that. But now, if if we're more diverse, you want to bring in different groups of people and all that, there's going to be conflict over those things. Like that happened in Great Britain where they were teaching I think they were teaching like lesbian and gay history or something in schools. And then the Muslims reacted against that. They said, no, this goes against our religion. You can't teach that. And then people were in a tough spot because they're like, wait, whose side do we take here? We don't want to
Yeah.
be labeled homophobes, but we don't want to go after Muslims either. So it creates all these conflicts. Whereas I would argue in a private setting, if you can divide this up, like there could be schools that teach Islamic law. There could be schools that teach Canaan law, all that. If people want to send their kids there, go ahead. But it's okay, you know in advance what you're getting into, what you're getting. Maybe you have prayer time during school, but you know in advance it's not being imposed on you. So,
Yeah. And it starts calling into question. And this is why I was talking about, I think we talked about this earlier, how some
yeah.
people might not be able to conceptualize some of these ideas. As you mentioned, like Hoppe was actually, we had learned something from, who was it? What was the guy's name?
Jürgen Habermas.
Yeah, Jürgen Habermas. And then
Habermas.
he's literally Habermas.
Habermas with an M.
Habermas.
Habermas.
Like,
Yep.
okay, so Habermas. And then he was literally in a class with Rothbard. And that's how you had to have information actually spreading.
Yeah.
So saying like this information is very new. Like, that's what I was wondering, if everybody could read this book, are we all at the point where we can understand these stuff? I'm not necessarily quite sure, but I'm very encouraged by seeing the reaction of the people who are actually exposed to this information. And that's why the freedom of speech is so key. We need more people speaking more ideas, having more people hear these things to figure out what's right and what's wrong. When you have that situation, what is that? It's a freedom of speech situation. Oh, you can't talk about homosexuality. It's blasphemy. Why? And then when you start talking about these things, it starts calling into question that whole thing that, oh, we can equally educate people. We should be able to have a centralized system where we equally spread the monies to all these people and all these ideas are equal. All the people going to it are equal. No, I can say, I'm making a decision. It is, I do not think it's equally positive to have Islam, Christianity, Judaism taught in school than it would to have a system that educates people on content that doesn't have that in it.
Yeah.
Because now when you start saying, oh no, religion is good, what religion is good? Which parts of religion are good? Like, is this something, this is something that I heard somewhere else, or Matt Dillahunty said this, where he said, he asked a Christian who called in on his show, and he said, would you allow me to read a verse of my choice to your child from the Bible? And the person was like, no. And he was like, yeah, that shows that you're a good person. Because like, what parts of the Bible are you willing to say, like, these are the good parts? Who gets to decide what is supposed to be taught? And just because one group thinks something is positive, if you have a system where you say every single student should be taught and funded from this central part in our state, and some of your students are Muslim, who are you to say that they are wrong to not want homosexuality in it? Not want a homosexual teacher, even if it's the person isn't teaching the homosexuality. I'm sure some of them would object to just somebody just being homosexual being around their child.
Yeah.
I think that is horrible.
Yeah.
I think a homosexual person is as capable in general of teaching mathematics to children as somebody who's heterosexual.
Yeah.
Some people disagree due to their belief systems. I think those people are worse people morally than the people who don't, or ethically than the people who don't. So when you have that centralized system, you those things, and I think more of those things are going to keep coming up, and these people's ideas are going to keep constantly getting struck against these these shores of reality. And I think these little ships that they've built will break up, and then they'll fall into the water. Some of them, unfortunately, might drown, but I think enough of them will come to the land of rationality and be like, okay, let's actually be on this solid ground of reason and the scientific method and actual evidence and backing up things, and then build an actual stronger ground on that. I think stronger institutions.
Well, I remember in high school, we had to debate different things, and the topic I got was I had to make the argument against separation of church and state, like why church should be enshrined in government. And it was funny because back then I was like, yeah, this is horrible. I can't argue this. Now I'm like, no, I can't. And it's just funny because back then I was like, how do I make this argument? And now I'm like, I'm still thinking the same thing.
This is the thing, you've had that idea when you were a kid. I just recently had that idea, I think a year and a half ago, and I had one of the thoughts in the Shorties videos I put up, and I just asked people, if you're American and you think the country's going badly, you think we're losing the things in the Constitution, but you're also religious. Whatever religion you believe in, do you think the country would be made better if the Constitution's aspect of separation of church and state was dropped and the politicians actually all adopted your belief system and used that as a guide to run the country? And if your answer is no, what does that say about your belief system?
Yeah.
If you literally think your belief system that explains entire existence is not something worth building a country on, teaching children based on, then why do you hold it as a belief system? That's something that I think is cognitive distancing in anybody who supports the separation of church and state and says they also believe in the one truth and the one God and things like that.
Well, what bothers me too, again, we've been talking about this for a while, but just the whole biases in academia and everything is like, it sort of is this patronizing view of students, like they somehow can't hear multiple beliefs and decide what's good or bad. And then one, it's patronizing, but I also wonder if it just has to do with the religious nature of academia. Like Tom Woods and Gad Saad's conversation about how they cited Jonathan Haidt's study about like being able to explain opposing positions. They can do it pretty well, but then you ask these people to explain our positions, they can't. They misrepresent, they make things up, all that. So it's not like they disagree. It's they've never even heard the positions accurately articulated, and I don't think that's by accident. But like, it's a combination, I think, of the religious nature of the ideology, but it's also you're not giving students a proper education. Like, I don't know if you heard my podcast with my other friend yet, but we talked about that. Like, you're not teaching people how to think. You're teaching people what to think. It's not okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to make these arguments, argue against them the best you can. Now you make these arguments, I'm going to argue. Like there isn't enough of that. It's more take this as gospel and don't question it. And it ultimately does everyone a disservice, the academics and the students themselves.
Yeah, and I think it comes from that childhood experience
Yeah.
where I think when we were children, a lot of us, me included, there were certain taboo topics that we were told. Our parents would be like, or authority figures would say, "Oh, that's a bad idea.
Yeah.
Why is it a bad idea? It's bad because I say it is." And then you as a child start developing that the way to live is by closing off certain paths of thought, certain ideas, certain things shouldn't be said, shouldn't be
Yeah.
heard. And that is the way the world works. And then we start growing up, and we're as adults, and now we're in control of these things, and we start reinforcing those and subjecting the next generation to those same limitations that we had. And thankfully, we've slowly by slowly broken down those things. And I think we have more and more freedoms as we keep going. Occasionally, people will backtrack and go to more oppression, more hiding of ideas. But in general, we've had a slow but constant move towards more information, more liberty, more freedom. And now I think we have the tools with the internet and the ability to share information that are unprecedented, that will actually get us to that point, to those things where one idea can really change the world very fast. Because I think one idea has been able to change the world before. It just takes a longer time than possible.
So a few other solutions. James Lindsay talks about classifying this as a religion. Apparently, I think he's actually working on a future book on that. So we'll review that. He wrote an essay that's up at the moment. It's pretty long, but it's some very good arguments, because the challenge here, I think, is that you could argue, okay, this doesn't fit a traditional religion in the sense there's no God, there's no miracles, but at the same time, as we've been discussing, there's dogma, there's faith, there's a moral imperative, all that. And if that's being imposed on people, well, it has the same effects for all intents and purposes. Again, even if you don't believe in dragons or snakes or whatever, talking snakes, but the idea that you're still imposing beliefs in school, and that's the point that always comes up. Like, they're taking this out of school. Some people are freaking out. They're like, the response from me and others is like, well, if people down south were saying Bible studies are required in school, you'd be freaking out. I'm like, as far as we're concerned, this is no better.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of it too, I think the approach that I've sort of taken is that people need to be brave. Like, call them out on this, question things that don't make sense. Don't go along just for the sake of fitting in. If things don't add up, ask for evidence. They say that they don't give it to you, say, I'm not going to have a discussion with you. You're not making the case. It's a thing you and I always make fun of. It's not my job to educate you. Well, no, it is. It's like, you want me to believe something. You want me to say, hey, I'm wrong about this. You're right. Okay. But then it falls on you to make that case as someone who disagrees with you. If you don't, I don't have a moral obligation to take what you say on faith. I don't work that way, and I don't see a case for it. So again, it's it's that be the change you wish to see in the world thing. If you want to really change people, you have to convince them and make your case. And look, if you find there's errors in your belief system, if you're honest, you revise them accordingly.
Yeah, and it goes back to the childhood thing, as we mentioned.
Yeah.
Mom, why is this wrong? It's wrong because I say so.
Yeah.
So why are you right that I shouldn't do this? Because I say so. I have the power. I'm the one who brought you here. That's the same thing you see in some of these people. Oh, this is wrong because of that. And this is something that you see in the state as well.
Yeah.
Oh, why should we fund these schools? We don't have to make the case. It's right because it's right. We have to tax you for your money and distribute your money to this thing. It's like, no, educate me and actually inform me. Don't school me. Educate me and actually inform me on why that is a positive thing. And I will willingly give you even more than that 15% you're extorting from me, because you've convinced me that is a positive thing for me to spend these monies on. Just make the case for it. And I think we'll have a more reasonable society.
We'll discuss this more in the next series, but the whole thing with education, it's like, if you analyze all these incentives and figure out, okay, this is why money is being wasted, this is why students are taking classes that have no value, all this, we could it wouldn't be easy, but it could lead to eventually the system being either collapsing and then something new rising, or the system being restructured. How? I think the former is more likely, but then people will get actual education. People will pay money for things they find valuable, learn things that they need, get more work experience. And look, if they want to learn more, there can be night classes. There will be lots of other alternatives, but people can feel, hey, this was worth all the money I paid to do this, and it's actually leading to something bigger. It's not putting me massively in debt and leaving me with no skills. Huh.
Yeah.
All right, so that's it for Cynical Theories. Hopefully, I hope everyone enjoyed this. It's been a very long but hopefully worthwhile discussion.
Yeah, I think it has, at least
Yeah.
for me. And we've had a few friends and other people comment on it, and that's been excellent. I think that's another thing. One thing I did mention in the 1619 series conversation, that was the one we had before this. We had the you're everything you consume. We had the 1619 project one. Then we've gone to this one. Now we're going to go into the education one next. And I think with the posting schedule, we'll probably post that first one before I finish posting this. I'm as I mentioned, had a strike on my YouTube channel, but that has inspired me and given me some extra fire to finally get up of the actual regular content and have an independent channel set up for this. And I'll talk about that more and
Sure.
keep a more regular posting schedule. Steven has invested in headphones, as you can see from the other videos, and a mic and a new computer. So we're looking forward to having all these. He's also been having conversations with other people and other locations talking about this topic and other topics. And we will continue that. We will continue as we're advocating for and being thankful for you to actually spend your time to listen to content like this, because I've gained a lot. I think Steven's gained a lot from listening to content like this, and to doubly and redouble and exponentially nth double, or to end that whole thing, is I'll also dedicate myself to making more content like this and getting it out to you in clips and other forms in order to encourage the spread of information. So I think it's been great. And one more thing with this one, once I'm done posting this, there will be some time left for people to comment on this series with certain different parameters or whatnot, comments, and we'll see if we'll come back and address any specific to this series conversation on critical theories, cynical theories, conversations in a separate one. If we come back to this topic, I think that will be possibly another video, but we'll leave it. We might even give it a month. This is not stuff that's going to die off immediately. Probably give it a month for all the videos to be up, for any people to have posted comments and taken their time and watched the videos in whatever sense. There's one person specifically on YouTube that broke down the videos. That we want to drop the name. The ZZ, the two guys with the Z names. Yeah, he broke down and he talked about different things, and we addressed the person. So there might be things like that where I think it might be worthwhile to come up from the conversations and things people have given us about the series that we might come back and address a month after I post this last part of it.
Sure.
So that's penciling in. But so that's it for now. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you all for listening.
Okay, so just stay on after we say bye, just to finish up and set up the next time.
Sure.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.